It began with the post-it notes. I came home from work on a Monday night to find a small, yellow post-it stuck to my fridge that read, "Did you lock the door?" It was my handwriting, but I had no memory of writing it. I thought maybe I'd left it there over the weekend after going out or something. But the more I looked at it, the stranger it felt. I always locked my door. It was habit. I never needed a reminder. Still, I shrugged it off, crumpled the note, and tossed it in the trash. I had dinner, watched a little TV, and went to bed. The next morning, as I was brushing my teeth, I noticed another note stuck to the bathroom mirror. This one said, "Don't forget your lunch." Again, it was my handwriting, the same blue pen I use for notes at work, but I hadn't packed a lunch in weeks. I'd been eating out lately, telling myself I'd get back to meal prep soon. This one I just peeled off and left on the counter, figuring maybe I was just tired and forgetting things. But by the third day, I couldn't ignore it anymore. That morning, there was a new post-it on my front door that simply said, "Stay home." The handwriting was mine, no question, but the pen was different. Red ink, a color I never used. My stomach twisted as I read it over and over. Who leaves notes for themselves and then forgets writing them? And stay home? From what? I had no clue what that meant. Trying to brush off the unsettling feeling, I crumpled up the note and left, but the message stuck with me all day. I catch myself glancing at the door of my office, half expecting to see another yellow note waiting for me. But by the time I got home, there was nothing new, and I breathed a sigh of relief. Until that night, just before I went to bed, I found another note, this time on my pillow. It read, "Check the closet." I felt a chill run through me. The closet? I stared at the note, hesitating, before finally crossing the room and opening it, my heart pounding. My closet was exactly as I'd left it, filled with clothes and shoes, nothing unusual. But as I turned to go back to bed, a faint smell hit me, something sharp and sour, like the scent of bleach. I looked around, sniffing, but the smell seemed to come and go, and eventually I convinced myself I was imagining it. The next morning, though, things escalated. I walked into the bathroom, and there was another post-it on the mirror, this time with a single word scrawled across it in shaky letters, "Run." It didn't look like my handwriting anymore. It was messy, frantic, like someone had written it in a hurry. I backed out of the bathroom, heart racing, and immediately checked every window and door in my apartment, but everything was locked up tight. No signs of forced entry, nothing out of place except that horrible note on the mirror. I grabbed it, crumpled it, and threw it in the trash, but the feeling of dread wouldn't leave me. All day, I tried to act normal, but my mind kept going back to the notes. Was someone messing with me? I decided I'd install a security camera that night, convinced that if I could just get proof, I'd figure out what was going on. But when I got home, there was a new note waiting for me, right in the middle of the living room floor. "It knows you're watching." I froze, my stomach churning. This time, the writing was smeared, like whoever or whatever had written it had been in a hurry. And that was when I noticed it, a faint handprint on the edge of the note, slightly smudged, as if the hand had been damp. Feeling sick, I went straight to my bedroom to grab my phone, only to find another note waiting for me on my nightstand. "Don't look in the mirror." I glanced at my reflection instinctively, feeling the hairs on my arms stand on end. For a moment, I swore I saw a flicker of movement in the mirror behind me, something dark and tall shifting just outside my line of sight. I whipped around, but there was no one there, nothing but empty air and the quiet, heavy stillness of my room. Desperate, I checked every inch of my apartment for cameras or signs that someone had been inside, but everything was just as it should be. I spent the rest of the night jumping at every sound, the creak of the pipes, the hum of the fridge, every little noise sending my nerves into overdrive. When I finally fell asleep, it was with the lights on, my phone clutched in my hand. The next morning, I woke up to find my entire bathroom mirror covered in posts, layer upon layer, each one with the same words scrawled in different handwriting. "Help." I stumbled back, horrified, feeling my throat tighten. It was as if 100 different hands had left messages, begging, each one more desperate than the last. Trembling, I peeled one off, but underneath, there was another one, and another, until my fingers were sticky with adhesive and my sink was littered with crumpled yellow squares. Then I noticed something else. Beneath all those notes, scratched into the glass with something sharp, were 2 words. "It's coming." I backed out of the bathroom, grabbing my phone to call the police. But when I opened the screen, there was a new note stuck to it. I hadn't put it there. It simply read, "Too late." I stumbled back, dropping my phone, and the lights flickered once, then went out, plunging the apartment into total darkness. In the silence, I heard a soft, dragging sound coming from the hallway, like someone shuffling slowly, deliberately, toward my room. My pulse thundered in my ears as I backed up against the wall, heart hammering as the sound grew louder, closer. I knew, deep down, that it was right outside my door. I could feel its presence, something heavy and dark, lingering just out of sight. And then, in the pitch black, I heard the sound of paper crinkling. A faint glow flickered to life in the darkness, a small, yellow square glowing faintly in the doorway. As I stared, another note appeared beside it, then another, filling the doorframe, each one pulsing with a sickly yellow light, like they were beckoning me. I didn't move, I didn't breathe, but the notes kept coming, layering one over another, forming some twisted, glowing barrier. Then, I saw one final message scrawled in huge, shaking letters across the top. "Let me in." I ran, out the back door, down the stairs, barefoot and barely dressed, not stopping until I was in my car, tearing out of the parking lot with my heart pounding in my throat. I haven't gone back since. I left my lease behind, my things, everything. I couldn't risk it. I told myself I was safe, that I'd gotten away. But last night, as I was unpacking boxes in my new apartment, I found something that made my blood run cold. A single post-it note stuck to the inside of a cabinet door. The writing wasn't mine, but I recognized it all the same. Just 2 words scratched across the yellow square. "Miss me?" The day it all fell apart, I was sitting in our living room, flipping through an old album. Lydia and I had spent hours arranging those photos one lazy Sunday afternoon, talking about trips we'd planned but hadn't taken yet, wondering what the future might hold. I hadn't looked at that album in ages, but for some reason, that afternoon, I'd pulled it out of the cabinet. I found myself running my fingers over the images, little snapshots of what used to be us. Lydia and I had been together almost 4 years, living together for 2. In that time, we'd built a life that felt stable, dependable. Sure, maybe some of the spark had dulled over time, but that seemed normal. Everyone has rough patches. At least, that's what I told myself when she started acting strange. It wasn't anything big at first. Little things, like how she'd laugh more at texts than at things I'd say, or how she started spending more time on her phone, her thumb swiping rapidly, a sly smile on her face. It was cute at first, seeing her smile like that, but I started to feel like an outsider watching a scene play out in front of me that I wasn't part of. She'd laugh, then glance at me, and that smile would disappear, replaced by a distracted look, like she'd suddenly remembered I was still in the room. And then there was the way she'd talk about work friends. She started hanging out with them more, going out for drinks after hours, or saying she'd grab coffee with someone before coming home. One name kept popping up, Aaron. I tried to brush it off. I didn't want to be that insecure partner who overreacted at the mention of a friend. Besides, I trusted her. We'd built everything on that trust. But one night, I caught a glimpse of her phone screen as she was typing, her fingers flying over the keyboard with a familiarity that felt unsettling. It was a message to Aaron, and as my eyes skimmed the words, I caught phrases like "last night was perfect and I can't wait to see you again." She noticed me watching and quickly closed her phone, her face blanking out into something unreadable. I tried to convince myself it was a misunderstanding. Maybe they'd hung out and had a good time. I was probably blowing things out of proportion. A few nights later, I came home late from work. The apartment was dark except for a faint glow from the living room. Lydia was on the couch, her face lit by her phone's screen, completely lost in whatever she was reading. She didn't even notice me walk in. I watched her from the doorway, debating whether to say something or just let it go. But then she looked up and saw me standing there, and there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Guilt, maybe? She forced a smile, tucked her phone away, and asked about my day. I shrugged, feeling this strange mix of love and suspicion twisting inside me. It all came to a head one Saturday night. Lydia was supposed to go to a work party, but something in her voice felt off when she told me. She seemed almost excited, and not in the usual way. She was wearing a new dress, something I'd never seen her in before, and had spent a lot longer getting ready than usual. "It's just a work thing," she'd said, waving it off with a casualness that felt too forced. I asked if I could go with her, maybe meet some of these work friends she'd been talking about so much. She paused, and for a moment, I thought I saw a panic flicker across her face. But then she laughed it off, telling me it was just a small thing, and that I wouldn't enjoy myself. After she left, I sat on the couch, staring at my phone, scrolling through old photos of us. I tried to push down the ache building inside, the nagging voice that kept telling me something was wrong. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. I needed to know. So I did something I'd never thought I'd do. I got in my car and drove across town to where she'd said the party was. I parked a few blocks away, feeling ridiculous like some kind of private detective, and walked to the bar. Through the window, I scanned the room, and then I saw her laughing, drink in hand, leaning close to someone, Aaron. They looked comfortable, too comfortable, like they'd done this 100 times before. I stood there, staring, unable to look away, as they leaned in, their heads close together, completely lost in their own world. I felt a wave of something dark and heavy, something that made me want to burst through the door and demand an explanation. But instead, I just stood there, frozen, feeling like I was watching a life that wasn't mine. After a few minutes, I forced myself to leave, walking away with a numbness that settled over me like a heavy blanket. When she came home that night, I was sitting at the kitchen table, waiting. She looked surprised to see me up, her expression flickering between guilt and something else, maybe annoyance. I asked her how the party was, and she hesitated for a moment before launching into some generic story about her coworkers. I let her talk, watching her closely, noticing how she avoided eye contact, how her voice wavered when she mentioned Aaron's name. Finally, I interrupted, asking her if there was something she needed to tell me. She went silent, her face dropping. She didn't try to deny it, didn't make excuses. She just looked down, whispering something about feeling trapped, about how she'd lost herself in our routine, in our life that felt too small. I sat there, numb, listening as she tried to explain, to justify, but her words felt hollow, like echoes of something long dead. I asked her to leave, and she did. No arguments, no pleading. She just packed a bag and walked out, closing the door softly behind her. The silence that followed was deafening. The days after that were surreal. I went through the motions, went to work, came home, barely eating, barely sleeping. The apartment felt like a shell, filled with all the things we'd collected together, reminders of a life that was now shattered. I started boxing up her things, shoving them into the back of a closet, trying to erase her presence from the spaces we'd shared. But her ghost lingered in every corner, in the scent that still clung to the couch, in the photos I couldn't bring myself to take down. Eventually, I started to rebuild one piece at a time. I picked up new hobbies, went out with friends, even redecorated the apartment, trying to make it feel like my space instead of ours. And slowly, the pain dulled. The nights got easier, the silence less suffocating. Months passed before I saw her again. It was at a coffee shop we used to go to, and she was there sitting across from Aaron, laughing, looking happy, like she hadn't left a wreckage behind. I felt a pang, something raw and unresolved, but I realized I was glad she didn't see me. I walked out before she could look up, leaving her behind like the ghost she'd become in my life. And maybe that's all we were in the end, ghosts of each other, shadows passing through different rooms. There was a time I thought she'd be my forever, but life is a way of rewriting endings you never asked for. And in a strange way, I felt grateful. I'd lost her, yes, but I'd also found something more important. The strength to let go, to move forward, and to rediscover who I was alone. I'd been living alone for a few years when I decided it was time for a fresh start. My life had grown predictable. Same coffee shop, same work route, same tiny apartment where I knew the sound of every neighbor's footsteps. So, when I got the chance to rent a small house on the edge of town, I jumped at it. It was modest, a little run down, but surrounded by woods and a wide-open sky. I loved it immediately. The neighborhood was sparse, just a handful of houses on the same dead-end road, each hidden from the others by trees. I barely saw anyone except for the occasional dog walker or kid on a bike. It was peaceful, just the kind of escape I'd been craving. The first time I saw him, it was just past twilight. I was taking out the trash, my eyes adjusting to the dimming light, when I noticed a figure standing at the edge of my driveway. A man, tall and lean, with a worn baseball cap pulled low over his face, just watching. He was still barely a silhouette against the trees, but I knew he was looking right at me. "Hi," I called out, feeling a little self-conscious but trying to be neighborly. He raised a hand in what seemed like a wave, but said nothing. Just kept standing there, his face half hidden. It was strange, and I felt a bit of a chill, but I brushed it off as a fluke. Some curious neighbor probably knew like me. The next day, I noticed a small package on my porch, a simple brown box with no return address. Inside was a single postcard, worn and faded, of a lighthouse by the ocean. There was no note, nothing written on it, just the postcard. It felt random, but I figured maybe one of the neighbors had left it as a kind of welcome. I propped it up on my mantle as a little mystery, a quirk of my new place. That night, I woke up to a faint tapping sound. It was soft, almost hesitant, like someone lightly rapping on the wall just outside my bedroom. My heart raced as I lay there, listening, wondering if I'd imagined it. But there was again the same rhythmic tap, tap, tap. I got up, crept to the window, and peeked outside. The yard was empty, just the moonlight casting shadows through the trees. The tapping stopped, and I told myself it must have been a branch or an animal. This was the woods, after all. I went back to bed, forcing myself to shake off the creeping unease that lingered long after the sounds had faded. A few nights later, it happened again, the same faint tapping, this time a little louder, a little closer. I rushed to the window, feeling my heart thud against my ribs. And there he was, the man in the baseball cap, standing just beyond the porch light, his head tilted as if he was listening for something. I froze, unsure whether to call out or stay quiet. After a few seconds, he turned and walked off, disappearing into the trees without a sound. The next morning, I found another package on my doorstep. This time, it was a small tin box, rusty at the edges. Inside was an old-fashioned pocket watch, tarnished and cracked. I turned it over in my hand, feeling the weight of it, the way it clicked faintly when I moved it. There was no note, no explanation, just the watch. I told myself it was probably just some local tradition, an odd way of welcoming the new neighbor. But there was something unsettling about it, something that made me feel watched. I put the watch next to the postcard, feeling like these strange gifts were clues to a story I didn't understand. The tapping returned the next night, louder than before, almost insistent. I didn't go to the window this time. I just lay there listening, my mind racing. It was too deliberate, too human, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was out there, waiting. The next morning, I decided to ask around the neighborhood, see if anyone knew who he was. I knocked on a few doors, but most people weren't home or didn't answer. The one person who did was an older woman, Mrs. Wren, who lived in the house at the very end of the road. When I mentioned the man, her face went pale. "Did he leave anything for you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded, feeling a chill run through me. Just some strange things, a postcard, a pocket watch. I thought it was some sort of welcome gesture. She shook her head slowly, her eyes darkening. He used to live here years ago, lived alone, kept to himself, but people would see him out at night, just watching, listening. He left things behind for certain people, and those things, they weren't gifts. My mouth went dry. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if she expected him to appear. "Those things he leaves, they're like promises. They tie you to him, in a way. Once you accept them, it's hard to make him stop." I felt a creeping dread settle over me, but I forced myself to stay calm. "What should I do? How do I make him stop?" She sighed, giving me a sympathetic look. "Don't take any more, and don't acknowledge him, no matter what. He'll lose interest eventually." I thanked her, though my hands were shaking, and hurried back home. I threw the postcard and the pocket watch in the trash, hoping it would break whatever strange hold he seemed to have. That night, the tapping returned, louder than ever, almost angry. It felt like it was coming from every wall, echoing through the house, relentless. I pulled the covers over my head, trying to drown it out, my heart racing as I lay there, frozen with fear. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. I waited, listening to the silence, hoping it was finally over. But then I heard something else, a faint scraping sound, coming from outside my bedroom window. I held my breath, afraid to look, but my curiosity got the better of me. I peered through the curtains and saw him, standing inches from the glass, his face obscured by the shadow of his cap. He didn't move, didn't say a word, just stared through the window with a cold, empty expression, his eyes fixed on me. I stumbled back, heart pounding, and ran to the kitchen, grabbing the phone to call the police. When they arrived, they found no one. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing to suggest anyone had been there at all. After that night, I stopped sleeping. I'd sit up, every light on, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. I didn't go near the windows, didn't open the door unless I had to. But every morning, there'd be another package, another gift waiting on my porch. I didn't open them. I didn't touch them. I just left them there, hoping he'd get the message and move on. Then one evening, I came home to find the front door wide open. I stood there, frozen, dread pooling in my stomach. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the living room, and felt my breath hitch. The postcard was back on the mantel, propped up as if it had never left. And next to it, the pocket watch, ticking faintly, its hands pointing to midnight. I left that night, drove to a friend's house, and never went back. I moved out a week later, taking nothing with me, not even my clothes. But sometimes, even now, I find myself looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him there, just beyond the light, waiting with another gift. A few years back, I took a job as a night driver for a medical courier service. It was mostly routine, picking up and delivering samples between hospitals and labs. I've been looking for night work to help pay off some debt, and it seemed easy enough. There was only one downside. Every night at 3 a.m., I had a regular pickup from an old, private clinic way out in the middle of nowhere. The place didn't even show up on GPS. My boss gave me printed directions with a warning to pay close attention, since the roads were unmarked and tricky. I'd only been to the clinic twice when I started noticing strange things. It was a small, 2-story building, pale and boxy, without a single sign of life outside. Every night, the front door would be unlocked but completely deserted. I'd head straight to the lab, which was through a long corridor and past empty patient rooms, all quiet except for the occasional hum of an old fluorescent light flickering overhead. The building had a weird energy about it, a heavy kind of silence that sat in your chest and made you want to walk a little faster. Still, I tried to ignore it and focus on the paycheck. Then, one night I arrived to find the clinic different. When I pulled into the lot, the whole place looked darker, like all the lights inside had been dimmed. The building seemed larger than I remembered, as if it had grown or stretched overnight. I shook it off, assuming it was a trick of the headlights or the fog that had rolled in. But as I walked up to the door, I noticed something I couldn't ignore. In the second-floor window, just barely visible in the dark, I saw someone standing there looking down at me. I'd never seen anyone upstairs before. In fact, I didn't think anyone even worked there. The place always felt deserted, like some relic left running by mistake. I looked up, trying to make out the figure's face, but all I could see was a silhouette, tall and still, watching me. I raised a hand, half expecting them to wave back, but they didn't move, didn't even blink. I turned away, feeling a weird twist in my stomach. Once inside, everything felt wrong. The corridor seemed longer, the lights dimmer. I could still see the flickering fluorescence, but this time, there was an odd buzzing sound, low and rhythmic, coming from somewhere deep within the building. I quickened my pace, trying not to think about the figure in the window, and reached the lab door. Normally, the samples I picked up were waiting in a cooler just inside the door. But that night, the cooler was missing. I looked around the room, but the shelves were all empty, the counters bare. Then, just as I was about to leave, I saw a note on the counter. It was written in thin, shaky handwriting that read, "Pick up downstairs." Downstairs? As far as I knew, there wasn't a downstairs in the clinic. My directions had never mentioned one, and I'd never seen any signs. But curiosity got the better of me. So I stepped back out into the hallway, and sure enough, there was a door at the far end that I'd somehow never noticed. It was old with peeling paint and looked like it hadn't been used in years. For a moment, I considered turning back, calling my boss, and telling him there was nothing there, but something about that door called to me. I felt like I'd come too far to leave without seeing what was down there. The door opened with a slow, whining creak, revealing a narrow staircase that spiraled down into darkness. I felt that strange buzzing again, stronger this time, vibrating in my chest. I turned on the flashlight on my phone and started down, one hand gripping the rail. The walls were damp, the air thick and stale. The smell was terrible, a mix of mildew and something metallic, like copper. I was halfway down when I heard it. A voice. It was faint, just a whisper, echoing up from the darkness below. At first, I couldn't make out what it was saying, but the further down I went, the clearer it became. "Help me!" It was repeated, over and over, soft and pleading. It was a woman's voice, strained, like she'd been saying it for a long, long time. By then, every instinct in me was screaming to turn around and leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone needed me, that if I walked away, I'd regret it forever. I reached the bottom of the stairs and found myself in a long, narrow hallway lined with doors. Each door was painted a different color. Faded, chipped shades of green, blue, red, but they were all closed, except for one at the end. The woman's voice was coming from behind it. I approached the door, hand trembling as I reached for the knob. It was cold, almost icy to the touch, and as I pushed it open, I could feel the buzzing intensify. Inside was a small, dark room, completely empty except for an old metal bed frame and a single, rusted chain that was bolted to the wall. The chain hung loosely, with a shackle at the end, open and empty, but it was clear someone had once been restrained here. The voice had stopped. I took a step into the room, looking around, and felt a wave of nausea hit me. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and that metallic smell was stronger than ever. I felt something under my shoe and looked down to see a small, tattered piece of cloth. I knelt down and picked it up, realizing it was a hospital bracelet, faded and torn, with a single name printed on it, Evelyn. Suddenly, I heard footsteps, slow, shuffling, coming from somewhere further down the hallway. I froze, heart pounding, as the footsteps got closer. I backed up against the wall, trying to make myself invisible, and held my breath. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and I could see a shadow, tall and thin, stretching into the room. It stayed there, unmoving, as though it were waiting for me to come out. I closed my eyes, too scared to even breathe, and then, in a whisper that was barely a breath, I heard it. "Help me!" I bolted. I ran up the stairs, heart racing, the buzzing growing louder and louder until it felt like it was inside my skull. I burst out of the door and slammed it shut behind me, not stopping until I was back in my car, my hands shaking as I tried to get the key in the ignition. I didn't look back as I sped away, barely able to keep the car on the road as I drove into the night. I called my boss the next day, told him I was quitting, and never went back to that clinic. But the strangest part? When I looked up the clinic's address online to see if I could find any information on Evelyn, I couldn't find anything. The clinic wasn't listed anywhere, and the address didn't even exist. It was like the place had been erased, or like it had never been there at all. I tried to forget about it, tried to convince myself it had been some kind of waking nightmare, but a few weeks later, I was clearing out my car when I found something wedged under the passenger seat, a hospital bracelet, torn and faded, with the name Evelyn printed on it. Since then, I've been haunted by strange, fleeting glimpses in the corners of mirrors or the rearview mirror of my car, shadows that seem to follow me wherever I go. And at night, sometimes around 3 a.m., I'll wake up to the sound of that same voice, soft and distant, whispering, "Help me." No matter where I am, no matter how far I go, I can't seem to shake the feeling that Evelyn is still out there, waiting, trapped in that endless, dark hallway. It was late, well past midnight, and I was out walking in the old part of town. My neighborhood was a quiet one, with narrow cobblestone streets lined by dimly lit, crumbling brownstones that looked frozen in time. The air had a strange stillness to it that night, a kind of heavy silence that seemed to close in around me, muffling even my footsteps. I decided to go for a walk because of an itch I couldn't shake, this feeling that something was wrong in my apartment, even though I couldn't pinpoint what. The lights had flickered a few times, shadows seemed to stretch in odd ways, and when I glanced at the mirror, I could swear my reflection lingered a little too long, its eyes following me just a beat past when I turned away. So I left, figuring a brisk walk might clear my head. As I walked, I noticed that every single building I passed had its windows darkened. Not just dim or unlit, but pitch black, as though there was nothing beyond them. Even the street lamps seemed dimmer than usual, casting only faint pools of light in a foggy haze. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled as I moved down the street, feeling like I was the only person left in the world. It was when I reached the end of the block that I first saw her. A woman stood in the middle of the street, wearing a long, dark coat. Her back was to me, her head tilted slightly as if she were listening to something just beyond her range. I paused, not wanting to startle her, but also unable to look away. Something about her was wrong, though I couldn't put my finger on it. Just as I was about to turn and take another route, she shifted, moving ever so slightly to the side. I froze. Even though I could only see her from behind, something about her movement felt familiar. Her posture, the way her head tilted, the slight bend in her shoulders, it felt exactly like me. I took a step back, heart pounding, and almost instinctively looked around, half expecting to find an audience hiding in the shadows, as if someone were playing an elaborate prank. But the street was empty, stretching out silently in both directions. I looked back, but she was still there, standing motionless in the middle of the road. I was about to say something, to call out to her, when she started walking. Her movements were slow, unnaturally precise, like someone rehearsing each step, practicing. And then, as she neared a street lamp, she stopped, her head lifting just slightly, and I felt my blood turn to ice. The street lamp's light caught her face, and there was no face at all. Just a smooth, blank expanse of skin where her features should have been, like an unfinished sculpture. And yet, somehow, I could feel her staring at me. It was a gaze without eyes, a presence without form, and yet it weighed down on me like gravity. I turned, nearly stumbling over my own feet as I started to walk faster, trying to put distance between us. My mind raced, running through every explanation I could think of, but nothing made sense. I chanced to glance over my shoulder, but the street was empty again, as though she'd never been there at all. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself it was just a trick of the light, my mind playing tricks on me in the dark. I quickened my pace, eager to get back to the comfort of my apartment. But as I neared my building, I saw her again, standing in front of my door, the same featureless face, her head tilted in that familiar, unnerving way. This time, she was holding something in her hand, a small, dark object held delicately, almost reverently, as though it were something precious. I stopped dead in my tracks, unable to move, watching her from across the street. She tilted her head a little further, as though acknowledging my presence, and then she lifted the object, holding it up to the faint glow of the street lamp. It was a key. My key. Panic surged through me. I clutched my pocket, feeling for my own keys, and found nothing. My stomach dropped as I realized my apartment keys were gone. I'd had them when I left. I was sure of it. And yet, somehow, she was holding them now, turning them over in her hand as though inspecting them. Slowly, deliberately, she slipped the key into the lock and opened the door, disappearing inside without a sound. I wanted to turn around, to run and never look back, but something compelled me to follow. Maybe it was desperation, a need to understand, or perhaps just that strange, irrational feeling that if I didn't go inside, something worse would happen. I crossed the street, my steps heavy, and entered the building, finding the stairwell empty and quiet. I walked up the stairs, each step echoing in the silence, until I reached my floor. My apartment door was open, just a crack, and I felt the suffocating weight of her presence on the other side. Slowly, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The apartment was exactly as I'd left it, with one difference. In the center of the room stood the woman, her back to me once again, staring at something in her hands. My stomach twisted as I realized she was holding a picture. One of my pictures, the old family photo that I kept on the bookshelf. I watched as she traced her finger along the faces, her movements deliberate, almost loving. And then, in one swift motion, she turned the photo to face me. My own face stared back from the picture, but it was wrong. Hollow, eyes dark and empty, a twisted smile stretching too wide across my features. My mouth moved, the photograph me whispering something, but I couldn't make out the words. I tried to step back, but I found my feet rooted in place, the air thick and heavy, pulling me closer. The woman turned her blank face toward me, lifting her hand to point, her finger trembling as it settled on my chest. She leaned in, her featureless face inches from mine, and I could feel a cold breath against my skin, carrying a faint, rasping whisper. "Forgotten," she hissed, the word twisting through the air, wrapping around me like smoke. "You forgot." My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of it, to grasp what she meant. But her voice continued, filling my head, overlapping with my own thoughts until I could barely tell where her words ended and mine began. "You left me," she whispered, and as she spoke, I felt a tug in the back of my mind, an old memory surfacing, hazy and distorted. A memory of someone, a friend, a sister, a woman I'd once known, whose face was now blurred and fading. She had worn my face, or maybe I'd worn hers. I couldn't remember. "I've been waiting," she said, her voice thick with a sadness that made my heart ache. "All these years, waiting for you." And then it hit me, like a wave crashing over me, a memory long buried and forgotten. She was right. There had been someone I'd promised to remember, someone I'd left behind in the past, lost to time. But her face, her name, they were gone, erased from my mind like dust blown from a page. As I stood there, helpless, I felt her hand close around mine, ice cold and unyielding. The walls of the apartment began to blur, fading into shadow, and I felt myself sinking, falling through layers of memory and darkness. Her voice was everywhere now, a chorus of whispers, pulling me down, binding me to her. "You're with me now," she murmured, her hand tightening around mine. You'll remember everything." The last thing I saw was her blank, shifting face, staring into me, through me, as the world slipped away, and I realized with dawning horror that I wasn't in my apartment anymore. The walls around us twisted, darkened, and I found myself standing in a place without form or light, with only her presence beside me, forever. And that's where I remain, trapped in an endless echo of memories and forgotten faces, lost to the world above. Every night, I see glimpses of my old life through a window that shifts and flickers like smoke, but I can't break through. I can only watch as shadows pass by, faceless and silent, waiting for someone to remember me. I've had sleep paralysis for years, so I'm used to the weird, terrifying things my mind conjures up in that frozen state between sleep and wakefulness. Most nights, it's the same nightmare. I wake up unable to move, pinned to the bed by some invisible force, my room dark and distorted, shadows shifting at the edges of my vision. I can't breathe, can't speak, and there's always something lurking, just out of sight. But last month, something changed. It was a Tuesday night just after 3 a.m., and I woke up unable to move. The familiar paralysis washed over me, pinning me down, and I braced myself for the usual shadow figure, the one that stands by the closet or hovers at the edge of my bed. But this time, there was no shadow, no monster, no looming presence, just silence and darkness. And then, in the quiet, I heard a voice, soft, almost apologetic. "Hey," it said, "I know you can't move, but don't be scared." I felt a chill go down my spine. It was a man's voice, calm and conversational, as if he were trying not to startle me. I couldn't turn my head, couldn't see where it was coming from, but the voice was close. Too close. "You're probably wondering who I am," he continued, his tone gentle, friendly. "I don't usually get to talk to people like this. They're usually too scared." A pause. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. "See, I'm the one who stands in the corner during sleep paralysis," he said casually. "I'm the shadow you see, the thing you're afraid of. But it's not what you think. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm more like a visitor." I lay there frozen, my mind racing. This wasn't possible. This was a dream, a hallucination. But the voice sounded so real, so grounded, like it was coming from just inches away. "You've seen me before, haven't you?" he asked. "Every time you get sleep paralysis. I've been there, in the corner or by the door. But I'm not what you think I am. I pass through sometimes like this. The paralysis, it's just a side effect." I tried to scream, to wake myself up, but my body wouldn't obey. "It's funny," he said, almost laughing. "You all think I'm some kind of monster. Something dark and evil, like a nightmare. But I'm not. I'm just a traveler stopping in for a while." I felt pressure on the bed, like someone was sitting down beside me. I couldn't see him, couldn't turn my head, but I could feel him there, close enough that I could sense his presence, feel the weight of his body pressing into the mattress. "I don't usually get to talk to people," he said again. "Usually, they're too afraid, or I'm in too much of a rush. But you're different. You're not as scared as the others. Not tonight." I was terrified, yes, but in a strange way, he was right. The longer he spoke, the less afraid I felt. His voice was soft, oddly reassuring, almost kind. "Why are you here?" I managed to whisper, my voice barely a rasp. There was a pause, and then he sighed, as if the answer were complicated. "I don't exactly know," he admitted. "I think I'm from somewhere else. Somewhere far away. I don't belong here. I'm not supposed to be here. But every once in a while, I get pulled into places like this. Your room, for example. It's like I slip between worlds." He laughed softly, a strange, melancholy sound. "It's not easy, moving through places like this. It takes a lot out of me. That's why you get the paralysis. It's me adjusting to your reality. It makes it hard for you to move." I lay there, trying to make sense of his words, the absurdity of it all. He wasn't real, I told myself. He couldn't be. He was just some hallucination conjured up by my brain, a figment of my imagination. But his voice, his presence, felt so real. "Don't worry," he said after a moment, as if sensing my confusion. "I'll be gone soon, just passing through like always. But before I go, I just wanted to say thank you." "For what?" I managed to choke out. "For not screaming," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "For not running. I don't get to talk to anyone. It gets lonely, The pressure lifted from the bed, and I felt the air shift, as if he were standing up, preparing to leave. Panic flared in me, a strange desperation to keep him there, to keep listening to his voice. But my mouth wouldn't move, and my mind was thick with confusion. "I'll see you around," he said, his voice fading. "Next time, don't be afraid. It's just me, just passing through." And then he was gone, just like that. The room fell silent, the air cleared, and I felt the weight of my body return. I could move again. I sat up, gasping, looking around the room, but there was no one there. Just me, alone in the dark. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next few nights were quiet. No sleep paralysis, no shadows in the corner, no voice. I told myself it had all been a dream, a vivid hallucination brought on by years of night terrors. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been real, that I'd spoken to something, someone that shouldn't exist. A week passed before it happened again. This time, I was ready. When I felt the familiar paralysis take hold, I didn't panic. I lay still, breathing evenly, waiting, and, as if on cue, I felt the weight settle at the edge of the bed, the familiar pressure in the air. "Hey," the voice said, sounding almost relieved. "You're not scared this time." I tried to smile, though my face was still frozen. I didn't know if you'd come back." A soft chuckle. I wasn't sure either. But here I am. We talked like that. In the dark, my body paralyzed, but my mind alert. hanging on every word. He told me things I couldn't understand, stories of strange places he'd seen, worlds that sounded like something out of a fever dream. Cities made of glass, forests where the trees whispered secrets, skies that burned with colors I'd never imagined. Every night for the next month, he came to visit, and every night, I felt less and less afraid. I started to look forward to his visits, to the strange stories he told, to the way his presence filled the room, calming and steady. I began to ask him questions, and he answered them with a quiet patience, his voice always gentle, always kind. But one night he sounded different, tired, weary, like he was struggling to hold on. "This might be my last visit," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why?" I asked, feeling a pang of fear I couldn't explain. He didn't answer for a long time. Finally, he said, "I think I'm getting too far from where I belong. It's getting harder to find my way back. I'm not supposed to be here, and if I stay too long, I might not be able to leave." I felt a strange ache, an emptiness I couldn't name. "But what happens if you can't leave?" A soft sigh. "I don't know, but I'd rather not find out." He was quiet for a long time, and I lay there, feeling the weight of his presence, knowing it might be the last time. Finally, he whispered, "Thank you for talking to me, for not being afraid." And then he was gone, and the room was empty. It's been months since that night. I don't know if he'll ever come back. Some nights, I lie awake, waiting for the familiar weight on the bed, for his quiet voice in the darkness, telling me about worlds beyond my own. But the shadows are empty, and the room is silent. And sometimes, in the quiet, I wonder if he's out there somewhere, still drifting, still searching for someone to talk to. Or if he finally found a place to call home. I never believed in curses. Bad luck, sure. Coincidences, maybe. But curses? That was the kind of thing you'd see in horror movies or hear about from friends trying to freak each other out. I thought I'd have laughed at the idea if someone had mentioned it. That was before I found the photograph. It was a normal Tuesday. I was walking home from work, cutting through the back alley behind a few local shops to avoid the evening crowds. I'd walked that route dozens of times, but this time something caught my eye, a small, worn photo lying face down in a puddle. It was nearly obscured by grime, but something about it drew me to it, almost like a magnet. I reached down and picked it up, shaking off the water. It was an old Polaroid of a group of 5 people, 4 of them sitting on a low brick wall, all in 70s-style clothes, grinning at the camera. They looked like they were somewhere rural, maybe the countryside, with a single large oak tree towering in the background. The woman in the middle had bright red hair and was wearing a wide-brimmed hat. The man beside her had a thick mustache and a lazy grin. The photo felt strangely personal, like they were a group of friends on some secret adventure. But then I noticed something odd. On the back of the photo, someone had scribbled a message in shaky, nearly illegible handwriting. "Do not look for us." It was such an eerie thing to write, like a warning or a dare. I laughed to myself and slipped it into my pocket, thinking I'd show it to my roommate Jackson later. He was into weird stuff like that. When I got home and pulled out the picture to show him, the laughter stopped. In the photo, only 4 people were sitting on the wall. The woman with the red hair was missing. I stared at it, convinced I was remembering it wrong, but I knew she'd been there, right in the middle, wearing that big, floppy hat. Her absence was impossible to ignore. The others were still grinning at the camera, seemingly unaware that their friend was missing. Jackson didn't think much of it. He shrugged, said it was probably a trick of memory. He told me I was overthinking it. "Stuff like that is just creepy, because you want it to be," he said with a grin, dismissing it as nothing more than a creepy found photo. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the chill that had settled in my bones. Over the next few days, I'd find myself drawn to the picture. Every time I looked at it, something felt different. It took me a while to realize why. Each time I examined it, another person was missing. First, it was the mustache man, then the girl at the end with the thick glasses. The photos seemed to be decaying somehow, the people vanishing one by one like a grim countdown. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was all in my head, maybe some weird prank or a hoax. But on the 5th day, there was only one person left, a guy with dark hair, sitting at the very edge of the wall, his face turned slightly toward the camera, eyes wide. He looked horrified. His smile was gone, replaced with a look of sheer terror, like he'd seen something just out of frame that no one else noticed. I felt nauseous, like whatever had taken the others was drawing closer, that somehow it was getting closer to me. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, twisted and horrified, staring at something behind me, as if warning me to look out. Around midnight, I finally decided I'd had enough. I threw the photo into the kitchen trash, muttering curses under my breath. I was done with whatever stupid game it was playing. If it was some kind of joke, I didn't want any part of it. But the next morning, the photo was back on my nightstand. I froze, staring at it in horror. It was impossible. I'd thrown it out, made sure to cover it with coffee grounds and leftover food scraps. There was no way it should have been there. My hands were shaking as I picked it up, and that's when I noticed the change. Now, the man with the dark hair was gone too. The photo was empty. The brick wall was still there, the big oak tree looming in the background, but the people were gone. Jackson was the one who convinced me to try burning it. I wasn't sure it would work, but I was desperate. We took it to the alley behind our building, where Jackson doused it in lighter fluid and set it on fire. We watched as the flames ate at the edges, curling the photo, the image disappearing into smoke and ash. Relief flooded over me as I watched it burn, thinking that would be the end of it. That night, I woke up to a strange smell in my room. It was faint, but unmistakable, the smell of burning paper. I sat up, heart pounding, and reached for the lamp. There on my nightstand was the photo, completely intact, the group of 5 people staring back at me like they'd never left. But this time, the man with the dark hair wasn't looking at something beyond the camera. He was looking directly at me. The next few days were a blur of fear. I tried everything I could think of, burying it, shredding it, even dumping it down a storm drain. But it kept coming back, each time more worn, as if it was angry, like it was feeding off my fear. And every time it reappeared, the people's faces grew more twisted, their eyes dark, hollow pits that seemed to follow me wherever I went. Then one morning, Jackson was gone. I woke up to his empty bed, his phone and wallet left on the nightstand. He'd vanished without a trace. I called his family, his friends, the police, but no one had seen him. It was as if he'd just ceased to exist. And when I stumbled back into my room, exhausted and panicked, I saw the photo lying on my bed. The group was back. They were all there, smiling at the camera, including Jackson, who was now standing at the far end of the brick wall, looking right at me, his smile frozen in terror. I tried to leave the city after that, but no matter where I went, the photo always followed. I'd find it slipped into my bag, tucked into the pages of a book, or lying on my pillow when I returned to my hotel room. It was always waiting, the people in it looking more desperate with each passing day, their eyes darker, their mouths stretched into hollow smiles. I'm writing this now from a small town miles from where I started, in a motel room with a broken lock. The photo is lying on the table in front of me, and I can feel their eyes on me, waiting, as if they're begging me to join them. I know it sounds insane, but I can't shake the feeling that it's a portal, some kind of window, into a place I don't want to see. I'm not sure how much longer I can keep running. They're always waiting, always watching, and with each day, I feel myself slipping like part of me is already there with them, fading into the empty space next to Jackson. I don't know what will happen when the last person disappears from the photo, but I'm terrified to find out. If you ever see a photograph lying on the ground, old and forgotten, don't pick it up. Don't look at it. Don't take it with you, because some things are better left lost. I've tried explaining what happened that night, but I always get the same look. People think I'm either messing with them or that I imagine the whole thing. So, I've stopped telling the story. But every so often, something reminds me, and I can't help but feel that creeping dread all over again. Here's what happened exactly as I remember it. About a year ago, I was working as a night shift custodian for a small community college. My shifts were from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and the job mostly involved me wandering around empty hallways and classrooms, picking up after the students. It was boring work, but I liked the solitude. I could put my headphones in, listen to music, and just drift. The college was one of those squat, brutalist buildings from the 1970s, all concrete and sharp angles. with narrow windows that barely let in any light. At night, the place was dead silent, just the echo of my footsteps and the hum of the fluorescent lights. Usually I'd start at one end of the building and work my way through until I got to the old wing, the part of the college they kept talking about renovating, but never actually did. I was on my way there that night, heading down the corridor on the second floor, when I saw the light. It was coming from one of the older classrooms, flickering like someone was inside, messing with the switches. Now, these classrooms were supposed to be locked after hours, and I was pretty sure I was the only person on the floor. But as I got closer, the flickering stopped, and the light went out completely. I tried the door, and sure enough, it was locked. I shrugged it off, figuring it was a wiring issue. This place was full of quirks, and weird electrical issues were common. But just as I was about to leave, I noticed something else. Faint writing on the door's small, fogged-up glass window. At first, I couldn't make it out, but as I squinted, I saw words. It was written backward, like someone had traced the letters from inside the room. "Please help me." I blinked, taking a step back, feeling a chill creep up my spine. The words faded, slowly dissolving until the glass was clear again, and I was left standing there, wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. I wanted to leave, just go back to my route, but my curiosity got the better of me. I took out my keys, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The room was empty, just rows of old desks and a chalkboard covered in faded math problems. But as I looked around, I noticed something strange. The back corner of the room had a broken, splintered floorboard, just a little bit raised. It was subtle, the kind of thing you wouldn't normally notice, but in the empty, silent room, it stood out. I walked over, hesitated, then knelt down and pressed on the broken board. It gave way with a creak, sliding aside to reveal a narrow, dark opening underneath. I wasn't sure what I'd find, but I felt drawn to it, almost like I had to see what was inside. I reached down, feeling around, and my hand brushed against something cold and metallic. I pulled it out, a small, silver locket covered in dust. The locket looked old, tarnished and delicate, and I could feel the weight of it in my palm. I opened it, and inside was a tiny, faded photograph of a young woman, probably about college age, with a soft smile and dark eyes that seemed to hold some hidden sadness. I'd never seen her before, and there was nothing about her that gave me any clue who she was. I slipped the locket into my pocket, planning to show it to someone in administration the next day. But as I left the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woman in the locket was watching me. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I kept feeling her eyes, like they were following me even after I closed the door. The rest of my shift was uneventful. I finished my rounds and clocked out, trying to push the whole thing from my mind. But as soon as I got home, I noticed something strange. The locket had started to feel warmer, almost like it was heating up against my skin. I opened it again, and the woman's face looked different somehow. Her eyes seemed sharper, almost more intense. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was overtired, and put the locket on my nightstand. That night, I had the strangest dream. I was back in college, wandering through the halls in the dark, hearing a faint humming, like an old lullaby. I followed the sound down endless corridors, twisting and turning until I reached the same classroom. The door was open, and inside, standing by the broken floorboard, was the woman from the locket. She was staring at me, her dark eyes glinting in the dim light, her lips barely moving as she hummed the haunting melody. I tried to speak, to ask who she was, but my voice was gone, trapped somewhere in my throat. She raised a finger to her lips, her eyes wide, and shook her head slowly, like she was warning me not to say a word. Then she reached out, placing a cold hand on my arm, and I felt a wave of panic flood over me. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, and as I looked over at the nightstand, I saw the locket had opened on its own. The woman's face stared back at me, her expression almost pleading, and I realized something horrible. The photograph had changed. Her hand was now raised, pressed against the inside of the locket, as if she was reaching out to me. I closed the locket, feeling my skin crawl, and shoved it into a drawer. I didn't want to look at it, didn't want to feel that chill again. But over the next few days, the dreams continued. Every night, I was back in the college, following her voice, feeling her cold hand on my arm, her eyes boring into me with that same silent plea. It got to the point where I couldn't sleep. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for that humming sound. Then one night, just after I dozed off, I woke up to the locket on my bed, open, the photograph staring up at me, her hand pressed even closer to the glass, like she was almost there. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the locket, got dressed, and drove back to the college in the middle of the night. I found myself standing outside that same classroom, hands shaking as I reached for the door handle. Inside, the room was dark and silent, just as empty as before. But then, as I turned to leave, I heard it, the faint sound of humming, coming from the back corner, right by the broken floorboard. I moved slowly, feeling my pulse race, and knelt down, pulling the floorboard back. There was nothing underneath, just an empty, dark space. But as I looked closer, I saw something scratched into the wood, faint but unmistakable. "Let me out!" I stumbled back, heart pounding, as the humming grew louder, filling the room with a low, mournful sound. I backed toward the door, but before I could reach it, the lights flickered, and I felt a cold hand close around my wrist. I turned, but there was no one there, just the feeling of that cold, invisible grip holding me tight. I could feel her there, like a presence in the air, whispering in my ear, her voice barely a whisper. "Please don't leave me here." I broke free, running out of the room, down the halls, out of the building, and into the night. The next day, I quit my job, told my boss I couldn't come back, and left without explaining why. The locket? I left it in that drawer, locked away, hoping I'd never see it again. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that humming, faint and distant, like it's calling to me from somewhere just out of reach. And every so often, I'll wake up with the feeling of that cold hand around my wrist, and I know she's still waiting, trapped in that classroom, whispering, humming, begging for someone to let her out. I was house-sitting for a friend in a remote, wooded area upstate. Her family had owned the house for years, and it had that cozy, worn-in feeling of a place that's been lived in by generations. The house was beautiful, large, with wooden beams and windows that looked out over miles of dense, untouched forest. But as soon as I arrived, I noticed how isolated it felt. There were no neighbors in sight, just trees pressing in on all sides. My friend left me a list of basic instructions: water the plants, feed her cat, keep an eye on the boiler, and, weirdly enough, she'd underlined a note at the bottom: "Don't open the basement door." It struck me as strange, but she was a quirky type and always had her reasons. I laughed it off, thinking maybe there was some kind of plumbing issue or repairs going on down there. The first couple of days passed peacefully. The cat was easygoing, mostly kept to itself, and I spent my time reading, making tea, and enjoying the stillness. At night, I'd light a fire in the living room and sit by the large windows, watching the trees sway in the wind. It felt like a retreat, but on the third night, something changed. I was curled up on the couch when I heard a soft thump coming from below. It was faint, but in the silence, it sounded louder than it should have. My heart skipped, but I reminded myself that it was probably just the boiler or the pipes. Old houses made strange noises, right? But a few minutes later, the sound came again, a soft, rhythmic thump. It almost sounded intentional. Against my better judgment, I got up and walked over to the door that led down to the basement. It was in the hallway, tucked behind a set of shelves. I could feel my pulse quicken as I pressed my ear to the door, listening. Nothing. After a minute, I shook my head, feeling silly, and went back to the living room. But the sounds continued. Over the next hour, I heard more thumps, then what sounded like soft scraping. It was almost like someone or something was moving around down there. I tried to distract myself with a book, telling myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the isolation get to me. Then, around midnight, I heard it, a clear, distinct knock on the basement door. 3 knocks. Slow. Deliberate. I froze, staring at the hallway where the door was just out of sight. The knock came again, and this time I couldn't ignore it. The cat was curled up on the couch, completely unbothered, and I wondered if I was losing my mind. Slowly, I crept back down the hall and stood outside the door, my hand hovering over the knob. I didn't dare open it, but I knocked back softly just once. There was a pause, and then, just as slowly, the knocks came again, perfectly mirroring mine. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. I didn't know if someone was messing with me, or if it was some animal trapped down there, but I wasn't about to open that door and find out. I backed away, went to my room, and locked the door behind me, spending the rest of the night wide awake, my ears straining for every little sound. But nothing else happened. The next morning, I almost convinced myself it had been a dream, maybe a half-awake hallucination. But when I went to the kitchen, there was something that made my blood run cold. A single dirty handprint on the basement door. It was smudged, almost child-sized, and smeared down the length of the door, as if someone or something had been trying to push it open. I left that door alone, but as the day went on, the noises began again. I tried to ignore them, tried to convince myself it was just the house settling. But by evening, the sounds were louder. A scraping that sounded like fingernails running down the door, faint whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I stayed out of the hallway as much as possible, my skin prickling with every creak and groan of the house. That night, I locked myself in my room again, too scared to go near the basement door. But around 3 a.m., I woke up to the unmistakable sound of someone walking down the hallway just outside my room. Slow, deliberate footsteps, each one heavy and dragging, like they were struggling with every step. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. I lay there, frozen, watching the shadows under the door. And then the footsteps stopped. Right outside my door, there was a pause, and then a soft, whispering voice, faint, almost like a child's voice, murmured from the other side, "Let me out." I don't know how long I lay there listening, barely breathing, but eventually, the footsteps shuffled away. I didn't sleep after that, lying awake until the first gray light of dawn crept through the window. I decided I was leaving, friend's cabin or not. As I packed my things, I noticed something on the kitchen counter that hadn't been there the night before. An old, worn photograph. It was faded, but I could make out two young girls in front of the house, one with her arm around the other, both smiling wide. But there was something wrong with the picture. The other girl, the one being held, had no face. Just a smudged, blank space where her features should have been. The photograph chilled me, and as soon as I threw my bags into the car, I called my friend, intending to tell her I'd left and to ask what the hell was up with that basement. She answered on the third ring, sounding groggy. "Hey," I started, trying to keep my voice calm. "Listen, I had to leave a bit early, but, why did you say not to open the basement door?" There was a long pause on the other end, and I heard her take a shaky breath. "Did you hear her?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. My skin crawled, and I felt the blood drain from my face. "Who?" "My sister," she said, her voice breaking. She drowned in the lake by the house when we were kids. But sometimes she still knocks. I thought if I warned you not to open it, you'd be safe." I thought. I didn't stay on the phone long enough to hear the rest. I just hung up, my heart hammering, and drove until I was miles away from that cabin. I haven't spoken to my friend since, and I don't know if I ever will. But sometimes, late at night, I'll wake up and swear I can hear it, a faint, slow tapping on my bedroom door. And every time it sounds like it's getting just a little bit closer. It started with a voicemail, a single, static-filled message that showed up on my phone one Saturday morning. I almost deleted it, thinking it was just another spam call, but curiosity got the better of me. The message began with silence, then a soft crackling sound, as if someone was trying to speak through a bad connection. After a few seconds, a voice finally came through, faint but clear. It sounded like my own voice, though maybe older, with a slight strain to it, like it was coming from far away. "It's me. I don't have much time. Listen, you need to remember where you came from." The message ended abruptly, cutting off with a click. I played it over 3 times, trying to understand if it was some sort of prank or a recording I'd somehow made by accident. But the voice was unmistakably mine. Confused and a little unnerved, I shrugged it off, figuring I'd sort it out later. But the next morning, there was another voicemail. It had arrived at 3:12 a.m., and again, it was from an unlisted number. I hesitated before playing it, feeling a prickling sensation along the back of my neck, a sense of dread that didn't make sense. This time, the message was clearer. You're not safe. Don't trust them. You need to get out. A chill crept down my spine. There was no way this was just a prank. The voice sounded desperate, frantic. And what's more, I had no idea who they were or why I would need to leave. But the urgency in the message was undeniable. I tried calling the number back, but my phone just gave me an error tone, the screen flashing unreachable. That night, I lay in bed, mind spinning, every sound in my apartment suddenly amplified and menacing. I kept checking my phone, half expecting another message to come through. At some point, I must have drifted off because I was awoken by a new alert around 3 a.m. This time, not a voicemail, but a single text-only notification. Do not look at the clock. My heart was pounding, and I stared at the message, fingers trembling, wondering if this was all some elaborate prank or if I was starting to lose it. But I couldn't help myself. I looked over at my alarm clock. It read 3 a.m. exactly. And then it blinked just once, the numbers flickering to 3 a.m. again, as if it had reset. I blinked hard, staring at the clock as the same numbers just hung there, unmoving, unchanging. I grabbed my phone to check the time, but my phone screen was blank, unresponsive, like it had shut down entirely. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic ticking like an old-fashioned clock. But I didn't own anything like that. The ticking grew louder, reverberating through my dark bedroom, until it was deafening, each tick echoing in my ears. Then, suddenly silence. I looked at the clock again. It had stopped at 3 a.m. I stared at it, feeling a sinking dread, wondering if I'd somehow broken the flow of time itself. The silence in the room was thick, almost alive, pressing down on me. I couldn't move, couldn't look away from those frozen numbers, as if they held me in place. And then, in the darkness, I saw movement, just the faintest outline of something in the far corner of my room. I could barely make it out, but the figure seemed to be watching me, a shadow darker than the dark. My body tensed, and I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to reach for my phone, but my hand wouldn't move, like I was trapped in a waking nightmare. The figure slowly moved closer, and as it came into the faint light of the clock's frozen display, I realized with a jolt of horror that it was me. The face, the hair, the shape, everything was exactly the same, down to the faint scar on my eyebrow. But there was something off in the eyes, empty, almost hollow, watching me with a cold, detached curiosity. The doppelganger leaned in close, its face inches from mine, and whispered, "You've forgotten where you belong." Then everything went dark. I woke up the next morning, disoriented and drenched in sweat, heart pounding. I glanced at the clock, half expecting to see it still stuck at 3 a.m., but it was 8:30, the sunlight streaming through my window. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself it had all been a nightmare, a vivid hallucination brought on by stress. I reached for my phone to check the time, and that's when I noticed it. A new message. "Meet me. You have until midnight." That was all it said. No location, no instructions, nothing. I sat there, staring at the words, feeling a cold dread settle into my bones. I knew, somehow, that this wasn't something I could ignore. I had to go wherever there was. The day passed in a blur, the hours slipping by faster than I could track. I barely noticed the minutes until the sun started to set, and an irrational fear clawed its way to the surface, a feeling that I was running out of time. At exactly 11:45, I felt compelled to leave my apartment, driven by a sense I couldn't explain, like something inside me was guiding me. I wandered through the streets, the city eerily quiet under the streetlights, until I found myself in an empty plaza, the air heavy and still. That's when I saw a figure standing in the shadows, a familiar shape. It was me again, only not. This version of me was wearing different clothes, something old-fashioned, out of place, like an image from a past life. They turned to face me, and I felt a dizzying sensation, like the world was tilting on its axis. "I told you not to look at the clock," the doppelganger said, its voice low and hollow, echoing in the empty plaza. What is this?" I managed, my voice shaking. They looked at me with something like pity. "You shouldn't be here. You left a long time ago. This place isn't meant for you anymore." "What do you mean? I live here, The doppelganger shook their head, cutting me off. "You're only a shadow now, a memory that wandered back. You should have stayed gone. Time doesn't move the same here. The more you stay, the more you'll forget." Panic rose in my chest as the reality of their words began to sink in. Memories flickered through my mind, fragments of moments I couldn't place, places I didn't recognize, as if my own life were slipping away from me. I reached out, trying to grab onto something solid, but my hand passed right through them, as though they were nothing more than mist. "Let go," they whispered, stepping back into the shadows. "You don't belong here. Not anymore." I felt my body grow lighter, my vision blurring as the world around me began to dissolve. The buildings, the plaza, even the night itself seemed to melt away, fading into darkness. And in that moment, I understood. I hadn't come back to my life. I'd left it behind, long ago. I was just a ghost haunting the edges of a memory, a piece of the past that had somehow slipped back into a life that wasn't mine anymore. As the darkness closed in, I heard the ticking of a clock, slow and steady, marking time in a place that had none. The last thing I saw was my own face, watching me with empty eyes until there was nothing left but silence. The first time I noticed anything strange, it was a smell, something faint like smoke just on the edge of burning. I'd be lying in bed, drifting off, and suddenly there it was, that faint, singed smell, too subtle to be from a neighbor's kitchen, too random to pin down. I'd sit up, sniff the air, try to figure out where it was coming from, but it would always fade before I got anywhere. One night, as I lay in bed, the smell seemed stronger, almost chokingly close, like something was burning right next to me. I jumped up, heart pounding, convinced there was a fire, but nothing was out of place. Still, the smell lingered, wrapping around me, clinging to my clothes and skin. After that, I started sleeping with the window open. Then, strange things started happening around the apartment. One morning, I found my kitchen chair pulled up to my bed, like I'd set it there to watch myself sleep. Other times, I'd find a light on in the middle of the night, or the closet door cracked open when I was sure I'd closed it. Small things, easy to brush off, and I tried to, but then I started noticing them in myself too. It was little at first, forgetting the end of a sentence, or feeling like I'd drifted off in the middle of a conversation. I'd be in the middle of reading an email or scrolling through my phone, and suddenly I'd blink, feeling like I'd just woken up, no idea what I'd been doing. One night, I ordered dinner, then sat down to watch TV. I remember picking up the remote, the menu screen loading, but the next thing I knew, my food was gone, and the clock showed it was almost midnight. By now, I was beginning to get uneasy, feeling like there was something wrong with me. The burning smell would appear, stronger each time, lingering like a ghost that clung to the walls. I told myself it was probably a neighbor's faulty wiring or an old furnace in the building. But the sense of unease was impossible to ignore. One night, I woke up to a strange sound. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming their fingers against glass. I sat up, trying to locate the source. It was coming from the bathroom. The air was thick with that burning smell as I moved slowly toward the door, hand reaching out but hesitating before touching the handle. I could hear my heart pounding, felt sweat slicking my skin, and then the tapping stopped. Just silence. When I finally worked up the courage to open the door, the bathroom was empty, everything in its place, but the mirror was fogged up, like someone had just stepped out of a hot shower. My skin prickled, but I turned away, went back to bed, and lay awake for the rest of the night, every nerve on edge, listening for the faintest sound. After that, things started escalating. I'd catch flashes of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows sliding along walls that didn't belong to anything. My own reflection in the bathroom mirror started looking different. It was subtle at first, a split-second delay, a flicker of something off in my eyes. I'd lean in, scrutinize myself, and catch nothing but my own weary face. But then I began noticing more disturbing changes. Once, as I was brushing my teeth, my reflection smiled at me when I wasn't smiling. Just a small, unsettling smile, like it was hiding something. I backed out of the bathroom, heart racing, but the moment I glanced back, my reflection was back to normal. Still, the image lingered in my mind long after. Every time I looked in the mirror, I half expected to see that same twisted smile. A week or so later, I started finding notes written in my handwriting. They were scattered around the apartment, usually left in odd places, tucked under my pillow, inside the fridge, on the bathroom mirror. They all had the same message, a single sentence, written neatly in my own handwriting. I know what you did. I didn't know what to make of it. I hadn't done anything. I was sure of it. But as the notes kept appearing, I began to doubt myself. Had I done something in one of those strange blank moments? Was I doing things without remembering them? The idea started to consume me. I was afraid to go to sleep, afraid of what I might wake up to. One night, I set up my phone to record me sleeping, hoping to catch myself in the act of leaving one of those notes. I left it propped up on the nightstand, hit record, and crawled into bed, feeling like a fool. But desperation outweighed embarrassment. I couldn't sleep, kept lying there with my eyes closed, waiting for something to happen. Hours passed, and eventually, exhaustion took over. In the morning, I reached for my phone with a mix of dread and curiosity. I hit play and watched myself lying there, unmoving, nothing strange. Minutes passed, and just when I was about to dismiss it as another dead end, something shifted. Around 3:30 a.m., I saw myself sit up. But it wasn't me. My movements were stiff, robotic, and my face, it was blank like all the life had drained out. I watched horrified as I got out of bed and walked to the mirror, my arms hanging limp at my sides. I stood there, staring at my own reflection, my body completely still, my face unreadable. Then my reflection tilted its head. Just my reflection. My actual self stayed frozen, staring straight ahead, but my reflection's head tilted, eyes narrowing, as though it was studying me. I felt a jolt of pure terror as I watched it reach up, placing its hand flat against the glass, a dark, twisted smile spreading across its face. And then I mouthed something my real self didn't say. My reflection was speaking to me, its mouth moving in slow, deliberate words I couldn't hear, couldn't understand. In the video, I turned, walked out of the frame, but my reflection stayed, watching me leave, that unnatural grin lingering, its eyes never leaving the camera. I stopped the video, shaking, feeling like I was going to be sick. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't call anyone. I couldn't even explain what I'd seen. Who would believe me? That night, I covered every mirror in the apartment. I didn't want to see that face again, that other me lurking behind the glass. But the next morning, I woke up to find all the mirrors uncovered, and on the bathroom mirror, written in red lipstick, were the words, "You can't hide." I was spiraling, feeling like I was losing my mind, but I couldn't leave. Every time I tried to pack a bag, I'd find myself back in the apartment, my hands empty, the door closed behind me. I'd sit down, try to collect my thoughts, and the next thing I knew, hours had passed, and it was dark again. Then last night, I woke up to the smell of burning, stronger than ever, filling my lungs, choking me. I stumbled out of bed, coughing, eyes watering, and saw a glow coming from the bathroom. The door was slightly ajar, flickering light spilling out from the crack. I pushed the door open, hands trembling, and saw myself in the mirror, standing there, bathed in a soft, unnatural glow. My reflection's skin was pale, almost translucent, with dark shadows under its eyes, lips curled into that awful, knowing smile. And as I watched, it lifted its hand, pointing directly at me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, pinned in place as it leaned closer, pressing its face to the glass. I heard it whisper, voice muffled but unmistakable. "Come closer." My legs moved without my permission, carrying me to the mirror, closer and closer, until my nose was almost touching the glass. My reflection's eyes bored into mine, and I felt it reach into me, something dark and cold flooding my chest, seeping into every part of me. And then everything went black. This morning, I woke up lying on the bathroom floor, the mirror shattered around me. My hands were bloodied, raw, like I'd punch my way out of the glass. But as I washed the blood away, I caught a glimpse of myself in the pieces of the broken mirror. My eyes looked different, darker, like they were hiding something just beneath the surface. I'm typing this now, but my hands don't feel like mine. They're moving on their own, fingers flying over the keys with an urgency I don't understand. My thoughts are slipping, sinking deeper, muffled, like I'm being buried under layers of ice. And I can feel it, the reflection, that thing inside the mirror. It's in here with me now, wearing my skin, using my hands. I don't know how much longer I'll be able to keep control. It's whispering, urging me to stop fighting, to let go. It promises it will be quick, painless, just like falling asleep. But I can't. I have to keep writing, keep holding on, because once I stop, I know I'll be gone. Just a shadow trapped behind the glass, watching as it lives my life, wearing my face. If anyone reads this, remember, don't trust your reflection, because once it sees you, it won't ever let you go. A few months ago, I took a job as a night janitor at an old office building downtown. The pay wasn't great, but it was enough to cover my bills while I figured out my next steps. The building was one of those grand Art Deco structures built in the 1920s, with marble floors, gilded elevators, and towering ceilings. It felt like a relic of another time, beautiful but slightly eerie, especially at night when it was just me and the hum of fluorescent lights. I worked the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift, all alone. The office had been mostly empty since the start of the pandemic, so besides a few executives who'd come in during the day, it was basically deserted. Just me, my mop bucket, and the occasional echo of my own footsteps. My duties were simple: clean the bathrooms, vacuum the halls, empty the trash. It was routine, and I was grateful for it until the night everything changed. It started subtly. About a month in, I noticed little things that felt off. I'd leave my cleaning cart in one spot, only to find it moved a few feet when I turned back. Tools would go missing, and I'd find them later on the opposite side of the floor. I chalked it up to forgetfulness. Long shifts alone can mess with your head. But then, one night around 2 a.m., I heard what sounded like a door creaking open down one of the long corridors. It startled me, because I knew I'd locked all the offices and checked every door like I always did. I called out, "Hello," just in case one of the executives had come in unexpectedly, but there was no response. Just the soft, echoing creak that sounded like it was moving farther down the hall. I hesitated, goosebumps prickling my arms, and decided to follow the sound. The hallway was dim, lit by only a few flickering lights. As I walked, I kept telling myself it was just the building settling, an old door frame expanding in the cool night air. But when I reached the end of the corridor, I saw a door, a small, unmarked door I hadn't noticed before, right next to the janitor's closet. I'd never opened that door, and I didn't even know what was behind it. But it was slightly ajar, and a faint light glowed from the narrow crack. I reached out and pushed it open, my heart pounding. Behind the door was a staircase spiraling down, leading to a basement level I didn't even know existed. I stood there for a moment, staring down into the dimly lit stairwell. I knew I should have left it alone, but something compelled me to go down. Maybe it was boredom, maybe curiosity, or maybe something else was pulling me forward. The stairs were old, creaking under my weight, and as I descended, I noticed the air growing colder and slightly damp, with a faint smell of mildew. At the bottom of the staircase, I found myself in a narrow hallway lined with small rooms. Each one had a metal door, and each door had a small glass window, dusty and smudged, making it hard to see inside. It looked almost like a series of holding cells. I stepped closer to one of the doors and peered through the glass. The room beyond was empty, just a small, dingy space with a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. But as I looked, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about that room felt wrong, like it had absorbed years of fear and anger. I backed away, suddenly wanting to leave. Just as I turned to go, I heard something behind me, a soft, scratching sound coming from one of the other rooms. I froze, my heart hammering, and looked down the hallway, where one of the doors was slightly open, just like the one upstairs. I should have run, Every instinct told me to leave and never come back. But something kept me rooted in place. I took a step toward the open door, then another, my hands trembling as I reached for the handle. I pushed it open, and my flashlight beam landed on a strange sight. A small, dusty desk with an old rotary phone sitting on it. The phone was off the hook, the receiver hanging down by its cord, swinging ever so slightly. The scratching sound grew louder, more insistent, and I realized it was coming from the walls, like something was moving just behind the plaster. I backed out of the room, my skin crawling, and turned to head back up the stairs. But as I reached the bottom step, the light in the basement flickered and went out completely, plunging me into darkness. Panic surged through me, and I fumbled for my flashlight, switching it on and pointing it back down the hall. For a moment, everything was still, just the silence, broken only by my ragged breathing. Then I heard it, soft footsteps echoing down the hallway, slowly but steadily growing louder. I couldn't see anyone, but the footsteps kept coming closer and closer, echoing in the narrow hall. I turned and ran up the stairs, my flashlight bouncing wildly, and when I reached the door at the top, I threw myself against it, pushing it open and slamming it shut behind me. I locked it, my hands shaking, and leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. I stood there listening, but the footsteps had stopped. The hallway was silent again, just as it had been before. I made my way back to my cleaning cart, deciding to call it a night, but when I reached the elevator to go back to the lobby, I froze. Inside the elevator, scribbled in thick black marker on the metal wall, were the words, "Come back. We've missed you." I stepped back, my heart hammering. I hadn't seen any writing when I'd taken the elevator up at the start of my shift, and I knew no one else was in the building. I reached out and touched the letters, as if to convince myself they were real, and felt the sticky residue of fresh ink. Whoever had written it had done it recently, maybe even while I was downstairs. I didn't finish my shift that night. I grabbed my jacket, locked up, and left the building, trying to shake the feeling that someone was watching me as I walked down the empty street. I told my boss the next morning that I was quitting, that I couldn't handle the night shift anymore. I never mentioned the basement, or the phone, or the footsteps. A few weeks later, out of curiosity, I searched for information on the building. I found an old newspaper article that mentioned something unsettling. Back in the 1940s, the basement had been used as a temporary holding area for criminals awaiting transfer to the county jail. The cells were cramped, with minimal light, and over the years, a few people had even died there, heart attacks, a suicide, even an escape attempt gone wrong. I haven't been back to the building since, but sometimes late at night, I still hear that faint scratching sound in my mind, like it's just behind the walls, waiting for someone else to come down into the dark. The first time I noticed the messages, I was half asleep, bleary-eyed and barely awake. It was 3 a.m., and I'd stumbled into the kitchen, craving water. As I opened the fridge door, the light cast a long, pale shadow across the counter. I almost missed it, but there, scribbled in black ink on a yellow sticky note, were the words, "Remember the chair." I squinted, confused. Remember the chair? My roommate Sarah had just moved out, but leaving me cryptic notes hadn't been her style. I grabbed the note, turned it over, and saw nothing else. No signature, no additional words. Just those 3 strange words floating in the dim light. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was a leftover note from Sarah, though the words didn't make much sense. I chugged some water, tossed the note, and stumbled back to bed. The next morning, I'd almost forgotten about it. The day was packed with work, a blur of meetings and emails. But when I came home and dropped my bag by the door, I froze. In the center of my living room, facing away from me, was an old wooden chair. I didn't own a wooden chair. It was a plain thing, a little battered, with faded paint and deep scratches along the arms, as if it had been clawed at over time. My skin prickled. This had to be a joke, right? A leftover from the previous tenant that maintenance had forgotten to move out? I paced around it, examining the strange marks on the backrest, my mind racing. I even checked the hall for a maintenance worker or a neighbor, but it was empty, and no one was around to see me haul it into the hallway. I left it there, half laughing at the absurdity, and went to bed. But the next morning it was back, The chair sat in the center of the living room again, facing the wall this time, as if it were punishing itself in a corner. My skin prickled with a deeper sense of unease. It wasn't like I'd forgotten putting it in the hallway. I had dragged it outside, and I'd heard the heavy door click shut behind me. And yet, there it was again, somehow back in its place. I swallowed hard, telling myself it had to be a prank. Some friend with a key messing with me, right? I called around, but nobody knew anything about the chair. Then, I remembered the sticky note. Remember the chair. For the first time, I thought, maybe that note was meant for me. The next day, I started seeing more notes. I'd find them in random places, always with that same scratchy handwriting. Words that didn't quite make sense, but sounded familiar somehow. A note on my bathroom mirror read, "Don't look at her." Another was tucked into my shoe, bearing the words, "Turn off the light before midnight." Each note filled me with an inexplicable dread, a sense that I was somehow following instructions I didn't understand. I tried to ignore them at first, leaving them where I found them, refusing to let them dictate my life. But that only seemed to make things worse. I began hearing footsteps at odd hours, soft and faint, as if someone were pacing slowly through my apartment. Shadows would shift in the corners of my vision, and sometimes, late at night, I'd catch glimpses of a figure standing just outside my bedroom door. She was always facing away, head tilted slightly, as though listening for something. I never saw her face, and I didn't want to. One night, as I lay in bed, I felt a strange compulsion to look under my pillow. I reached beneath it, and my fingers brushed paper. My pulse raced as I pulled out another note, the words on it jumbled and smeared. "You left the door unlocked." I sat up, heart pounding. My front door. Had I forgotten to lock it? I tiptoed to the door and checked, and sure enough, it was unlocked. I couldn't remember the last time I'd left it that way. That night, I bolted every lock, double-checking everything. I lay in bed, wide awake, clutching a flashlight under the covers. Every creak and rustle felt amplified, each noise filling me with dread. Just as I started to drift off, there was a soft rustle beside me. I froze, flashlight gripped tight, my breath caught in my throat. Then came a whisper, a soft murmur, like words forming without sound. I whipped the flashlight toward the sound, shining it over the empty bed. But just as I started to lower it, I caught a glimpse of the chair. It was sitting in the corner of my room now, angled toward me, as if it had been watching the whole time. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I found a note in the kitchen, sit in the chair. For hours, I stared at the note, horrified by the thought of following its instruction. My whole body seemed to reject the idea, as if some deep instinct knew that sitting in that chair would be a mistake. But as the day wore on, the words felt heavier, pressing down on me, and by nightfall, I was worn out, exhausted by the relentless feeling of being watched. I dragged the chair into the center of the room and sat down, feeling the cold wood beneath me. I waited, my hands clenched, my breath shallow. Nothing happened. Then, just as I started to stand, the light in my apartment flickered and dimmed. Shadows thickened around me, swirling like dark clouds, pooling on the floor. I felt my own shadow begin to stretch and twist, elongating until it loomed over me, spilling across the walls, bending into unnatural shapes. A shape formed across from me, a figure seated in an invisible chair, mirroring my posture. It was her, the shadow I'd seen in glimpses, the one that had been haunting my doorways. Only now I could see her face. It was a blurred version of my own, twisted and dark, her mouth slightly open in a mocking smile. She leaned forward, her voice low and cold, like a whisper in a dead language. "Thank you for inviting me in." I tried to move, but I couldn't. My hands felt glued to the arms of the chair, my legs rooted to the floor. I watched helplessly as she stood, her shadow stepping free from mine, stretching until it was fully formed, a perfect, hollow replica of me. She took a step forward, then another, circling around me, that same mocking smile fixed on her face. "It's a shame you didn't follow the rules," she murmured, her voice echoing in my mind. "I left the notes for a reason. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but no sound came out. My own voice had abandoned me, replaced by her cold, empty gaze. She leaned in close, her mouth next to my ear. "Don't worry," she whispered. "I'll take good care of your life." And then, without a backward glance, she walked out the door. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed, staring at the empty room, feeling a hollowness settle over me. Hours passed, maybe days. Eventually, I found the strength to stand, but the world felt distant, muted, like I was watching my life through a thick pane of glass. Now, I drift through my days, a shadow of myself, watching from the corners, caught in a life that doesn't quite fit. People see me, talk to me, even laugh with me, but there's something missing, a part of me lost that night. I can still feel her out there, wearing my face, moving through the world like I used to. And every now and then, I find new notes, scraps of paper, fragments of thoughts, messages scribbled in the same scratchy handwriting. They're her reminders, little things left behind, almost like taunts. The latest note simply says, "Thank you for remembering the chair." And I know, wherever she is, she smiles. I was about 2 weeks into my night security job at Brookhaven Medical Research Facility when things started getting weird. The place wasn't a hospital exactly. It was more of a lab complex on the outskirts of town. The building was set back from the road, surrounded by thick woods, and in all honesty, I thought I'd lucked out when I got hired. All I had to do was walk the halls, monitor the empty offices and labs, and once in a while sit at the desk watching silent security cameras. Most nights were routine, and as boring as it sounds, I was happy with it. My only real job was to make sure no one was sneaking around. The labs were filled with expensive equipment, so they wanted someone on site 24/7. But since the place was usually empty by the time my shift started, it was just me and the faint hum of machinery all night long. Then, one night, I started noticing small, strange things on my rounds. I'd find doors I was sure I'd locked standing slightly open or lights left on in rooms that should have been dark. It happened too often for it to be coincidence, but I convinced myself it was probably just some staff member who'd been working late. Still, I made sure to double-check everything each time I made my rounds. Around the 3rd week, I started hearing noises. They were faint at first, a tap here, a creak there, but in a silent building, even the smallest sound stands out. The first time I heard it, I'd been walking past Lab 6, and I heard a quiet shuffling sound inside. I froze, my hand hovering over my flashlight, and pressed my ear to the door. There was nothing for a moment, just the soft hum of the building's ventilation system. But then I heard it again, like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, my flashlight casting a dim beam across the sterile white countertops and shelves of strange equipment. The room was empty, the air still, but as I swung my light around, something caught my eye. In the far corner of the lab was a single, faint handprint on the glass wall, like someone had pressed their hand against it with wet fingers. But it wasn't wet. It was dark and sticky, and it left a thin trail down the glass like something had been dragged along it. I tried to brush it off, chalking it up to some experiment gone wrong, or maybe a prank by one of the researchers. I cleaned the glass and left, but that handprint stuck with me for the rest of the night. The following night, I came in feeling a little on edge. It didn't help that the place felt emptier than usual, the hallways echoing in a way that made every footstep sound louder, sharper. As I did my rounds, I felt like I was being watched, like there was something just around each corner, waiting for me. At one point, while checking the empty office wing, I passed by a window overlooking the back parking lot. The lights out there were dim, casting strange shadows across the asphalt, and just as I was about to turn away, I saw something move. It was a figure standing just on the edge of the light, barely visible. They were too far away to make out any details, but I could see the outline of a person, motionless and facing the building. I squinted, trying to get a better look, but before I could, they turned and walked into the trees, vanishing into the darkness. I waited, half expecting them to come back, but they didn't. Shaken, I continued my rounds, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But when I checked the cameras back at the security desk, there was no sign of anyone in the parking lot. I rewound the footage, watching the same grainy feed over and over, but the lot stayed empty, no figure, no movement. Then came the night I saw the hallway lights flicker. I'd been sitting at the security desk, half asleep, when the monitors showed the lights in lab wing be dimming, then blinking out entirely. I got up, grumbling to myself, figuring it was probably a blown fuse. But as I headed down the hallway, I noticed that the doors were slightly ajar. Each one, lined up in a row, cracked open just enough for someone to peer through. I went to close them, checking inside each room as I passed, but each lab was empty, just rows of silent equipment and the faint smell of antiseptic. When I reached the last door, I stepped inside, my flashlight casting a pale circle across the floor. And then I saw it, another handprint, right in the middle of the floor, smeared as if someone had pressed their hand into the ground and dragged it backward. There was something unsettling about the shape of it, too, like the fingers were too long, almost claw-like. I backed out of the room and headed straight for the front desk, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. I was ready to leave, to call it quits, but as I approached the desk, I noticed something strange on the monitors. One of the cameras in the lower basement had been switched to static, a grainy haze filling the screen. That was odd. No one ever went down to the lower basement, and there was nothing there except storage rooms and old equipment. Against my better judgment, I decided to check it out. The stairwell leading to the basement was cold, the air thick with a musty, almost metallic smell. The flickering light overhead cast shadows that seemed to twist and shift as I descended, and I had to fight the urge to turn back. When I reached the basement, the smell grew stronger, like old rust or something decaying. The hallway stretched out in front of me, dimly lit by the single emergency light at the far end. As I moved down the corridor, I saw something on the floor, a trail of dark, reddish stains leading from one of the storage rooms. My heart pounded as I followed it, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. I reached the door at the end of the trail, my hand shaking as I gripped the handle. I hesitated, half hoping I'd wake up and find this was all some twisted dream. But I forced myself to open it, stepping inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from my flashlight. And in the center of the room, lying on the cold concrete floor, was a shape. It looked like a person, but something was terribly wrong. Its limbs were twisted at odd angles, stretched in ways that didn't seem possible, and its face was turned away, shrouded in shadow. It lay there, utterly still, like a mannequin someone had abandoned in the dark. I backed away, my mind racing, but as I turned to leave, I heard a sound, a faint, shuffling noise, like something dragging itself across the floor. I whipped around, my flashlight catching movement as the figure on the floor began to rise, unfolding its limbs with a slow, unnatural grace. Its head turned, and I saw its face, twisted and stretched, the eyes wide and vacant, mouth hanging open in a silent scream. I stumbled back, dropping my flashlight. The light rolled across the floor, casting erratic shadows as the figure staggered toward me, its limbs jerking with each step. I scrambled out of the room, slamming the door behind me and running up the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't stop until I reached the security desk, grabbing my bag and sprinting out of the building. I didn't even bother locking the doors behind me. I got into my car and drove away, not stopping until I was miles from the facility, the horror of what I'd seen playing over and over in my mind. The next morning, I called the facility to quit, and an unfamiliar voice answered. I told them who I was, that I wouldn't be coming back, but the voice on the other end seemed confused. "I'm sorry," they said. "We don't have a night security position. Haven't had one for years. The facility's been closed since last winter." I hung up, staring at my phone, unable to process what I'd just heard. I checked the address online, and there it was, the building, abandoned and boarded up, windows dark, surrounded by a chain-link fence. A place that hadn't seen a soul in months. But I knew what I'd seen, and as I looked closer at the satellite image, my blood ran cold. Right there, in the shadow of the building, was a faint, stretched-out shape lying on the ground, almost like someone was waiting by the front doors, just out of sight. The first time I saw my reflection move, I told myself it was just a trick of the light. It happened on a Wednesday morning while I was brushing my teeth. I was standing in the bathroom, bleary-eyed, mouth full of toothpaste, when I caught my reflection glancing sideways at me. Just a quick, darting look, a flicker of something in the corner of my eye. By the time I looked closer, everything was back to normal. My reflection was just standing there, mimicking my movements like always. I laughed it off, shaking my head. I hadn't been sleeping well lately, so I figured my mind was playing tricks on me. But over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I'd be getting ready in front of the mirror and feel this prickling on the back of my neck, this nagging sense that I was being watched. And it wasn't coming from behind me. Then, a week later, I caught it again. This time, I was washing my face. I leaned over the sink, scrubbing away, and when I looked up, my reflection was already staring at me, its head tilted just slightly to the side. I froze, the water dripping down my face, eyes wide. My reflection stood there, smiling this faint, unsettling smile, its head cocked just enough to look wrong, like it was seeing me for the first time. And then, just as quickly, it snapped back, mirroring me perfectly, the smile gone, the head straight. I stumbled back from the sink, heart pounding, telling myself it was just my imagination. But I knew what I'd seen, and from that moment on, I avoided mirrors as much as possible. It wasn't just the bathroom mirror either. Every reflective surface made me uneasy. Windows, car mirrors, shop displays, anywhere I might see my reflection staring back. I'd catch myself glancing, half expecting to see that same strange smile, that same slight tilt of the head. But every time, my reflection behaved normally. Always the same movements, always synchronized, as if daring me to catch it again. One night, a few weeks later, I was lying in bed, unable to sleep, and decided to go get a drink of water. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that presses in on you. As I walked down the hallway, I passed the big mirror by the front door. I'd been avoiding it for days, but as I glanced over, I felt a chill run down my spine. My reflection wasn't there. I stopped, blinking, convinced I'd imagined it. But there was no one staring back at me. Just an empty hallway, the mirror reflecting nothing but the walls behind me. I raised a trembling hand and waved it in front of the mirror, half hoping that some trick of the light would suddenly make my reflection reappear. But the mirror stayed empty, like it was a window into some other hallway, a place where I didn't exist. I backed away, heart racing, and went back to my room, telling myself I was just tired, that it would be back to normal in the morning. I slept fitfully, dreams haunted by empty mirrors and strange, silent figures. The next day, I forced myself to check the mirror again, feeling both terrified and foolish. But my reflection was there, perfectly normal, mimicking me like nothing had ever happened. I tried to act like it was over, like I just had a weird dream, but the sense of wrongness lingered. Every time I looked in the mirror, I half expected to see that empty hallway, that other place, staring back. Then one night it happened again. I was brushing my teeth, staring at the mirror, telling myself I was imagining things when my reflection stopped brushing. I was mid-motion, my toothbrush halfway to my mouth, and my reflection just froze. I stopped too, hand hovering in the air, my mouth open in shock. Slowly, as if savoring the moment, my reflection lowered its toothbrush, set it down on the counter, and turned to look at me. It wasn't a trick of the light this time. It wasn't a flicker or a glance. My reflection was standing still, staring at me with that same slight smile, a look that was almost curious. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. My reflection just tilted its head again, that same unnatural angle, and for the first time, I noticed that its eyes weren't quite the same as mine. They were darker, deeper, like there was something beneath the surface, watching, waiting. It didn't speak, didn't move, just watched me, its gaze unervingly steady. And then it raised a hand. It was a slow, deliberate movement, almost mocking. I watched, frozen, as it pressed its palm against the mirror, as if inviting me to do the same. I wanted to scream, to run, but something held me there, something I couldn't name. My hand trembled as I raised it, inching closer to the glass, until my fingers were just a hair's breadth from touching it. Our fingertips met. The glass was cold, colder than it should have been, almost like ice. The room seemed to dim, the shadows stretching out. and for a second, it felt like I was falling forward, pulled into the mirror, drawn toward those dark, unblinking eyes. Then everything snapped back. I stumbled backward, gasping, and the bathroom was just a bathroom again, the mirror reflecting my wide-eyed, terrified face, every movement perfectly synchronized. After that, I tried to avoid mirrors altogether. I covered them with sheets, threw towels over them, did everything I could to keep that other me out of sight. But it didn't matter. I'd catch glimpses of it in windows, in dark screens, in anything that reflected. Sometimes it would just be a shadow in the background, lingering like a faint, dark stain. Other times, I'd see it watching me directly, that slight smile playing at its lips. It was almost like it was learning. Then last night it did something new. I was lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, when I heard a faint rustling noise. I turned my head, expecting to see a shadow or a trick of the light, but my heart stopped when I saw it. In the corner of my room, just out of reach of the light, there was a mirror I'd never seen before. A tall, narrow thing, like an old-fashioned dressing mirror with a dark, wooden frame. And standing in it was my reflection. Not a reflection of me lying in bed. No, my reflection was standing, facing me, hands pressed flat against the glass, as if it were waiting for something. It smiled, that same unsettling tilt of the head, watching me from the darkness. Slowly, it lifted a hand and beckoned. I don't remember getting out of bed. I don't remember crossing the room. All I know is that, before I realized it, I was standing in front of the mirror, my own face staring back at me with that same hungry look. I raised a hand to touch the glass, feeling that icy chill again. And for the briefest moment, I saw something. Another place, another world, dark and vast, stretching out behind my reflection like an endless shadow. My reflection leaned in, pressing its forehead against the glass, and whispered, "Come with me." I don't know how I broke free. I must have turned and run back to bed, because the next thing I knew, I was lying there, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding, the mirror gone. But now, every time I close my eyes, I see it. I see that dark world, that endless shadow, stretching out behind the glass. And I know, somehow, that my reflection is still there, watching, waiting. And one day, it won't be in the mirror anymore. It'll be here in my plate. I got hired last winter as the overnight bellman at the Porter Hotel. It wasn't the most glamorous gig, but the pay was good, and I figured I'd get a lot of downtime. The place was old, really old, and sort of eerie with its dim lamps and faded wallpaper, but it had this kind of dusty charm to it. The hotel manager, Mr. Keene, was a quiet, stiff guy, always neatly dressed in a suit that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1940s. He had a way of just appearing behind you without a sound, giving you a nod before gliding back down the hallway. It was on my third shift that he pulled me aside and told me about room 717. "Mr. Cross, as a reminder, room 717 remains closed for renovations," he said, his voice soft and almost whispery. "There should be no reason to enter it, and if you see the door open, simply close it." That felt weird, but I just nodded. As it turned out, most of my shift involved fetching drinks, unlocking doors for drunk guests, and helping elderly patrons with their suitcases. Easy work, really. But every so often, I'd pass the 7th floor, and there was room 717 standing at the end of the hall, its door just barely open. Each time I passed it, I felt a little pull, a strange temptation to just take a quick look. But the door, the dim glow spilling into the hallway, it all gave me the creeps. I'd feel my steps slow as I walked by, my eyes lingering on the faint crack, wondering why it was open and what was on the other side. But I'd always just pull the door closed, do my rounds, and try to ignore it. One night, around 2 a.m., I was in the lobby trying to keep myself awake by flipping through an old magazine when the front desk phone rang. I was the only one on shift, so I picked it up expecting a guest needing extra towels or something. Instead, there was silence, followed by the faint crackle of static. "Hello," I said, waiting for some sleepy voice to reply. But instead, I heard a slow, muffled whisper, like someone was speaking from far away, their voice barely audible. I could make out the word 7th, but the rest was too garbled to understand. and then the line went dead. Something about the call made me uneasy. I checked the security monitor, and sure enough, room 717's door was open again, wider than usual this time, almost as if it was inviting me in. I told myself it was just curiosity that made me walk up there, just to check, just to close the door. But the hallway felt longer as I approached it, like I was walking towards something that shouldn't be there. When I reached room 717, the door was open wide enough that I could see into the room. There was a faint, amber glow from a table lamp inside, casting long shadows along the patterned wallpaper. The air felt thick, almost heavy, and that strange feeling of being pulled was stronger than ever. I told myself I'd just step inside for a moment, take a quick look, and then get out. The second I crossed the threshold, though, the door swung shut behind me with a soft click that echoed in the silent room. Inside, the room looked like it had been frozen in time. The bed was perfectly made, covered in a burgundy bedspread that looked thick with dust. An old rotary phone sat on the nightstand, and there was a single, high-back chair in the corner, facing away from the bed. Everything was faded, washed out, like the colors had been drained over the years. I could almost feel a chill hanging in the air, a sense that the room was wrong. And then the phone rang. I jumped, my heart racing as the shrill sound pierced the silence. The old rotary phone on the nightstand was vibrating slightly, its worn handle rattling with each ring. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to leave, but something compelled me to pick it up. When I raised the receiver to my ear, I heard a soft, ragged breathing on the other end. "Hello," I said, my voice barely a whisper. For a long moment, there was nothing but that slow, heavy breathing. And then a voice, low, scratchy, almost guttural, whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." I dropped the receiver, my heart hammering in my chest. I was about to turn and bolt when I noticed something in the corner of my eye. The high-back chair that had been facing the wall was now facing me. It had moved, ever so slightly, and sitting in its shadow was a figure, a woman, her head turned away, her face obscured by her long, matted hair. I froze, feeling an overwhelming dread settle over me. The woman didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe, but I could feel her presence filling the room, suffocating me. The air felt thick, oppressive, like it was pressing down on me, holding me in place. Slowly, as if sensing my presence, the woman began to turn her head, her movements jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on broken strings. My heart pounded as her face came into view, pale, waxy, her mouth stretched in a wide, unnatural grin that showed too many teeth. Her eyes were wide, hollow, as if she was staring through me, her gaze fixed on something beyond. I stumbled back, trying to scream, but no sound came out. My legs felt heavy, my body frozen in terror, as she slowly lifted a hand, pointing directly at me with fingers that were too long, too thin. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went dark. The room vanished, replaced by an endless blackness that swallowed everything, leaving only the faint sound of the phone still rattling in the background. When I opened my eyes, I was standing in the hallway outside room 717. The door was closed, locked tight, and the hallway was empty. For a second, I thought maybe I'd dreamed the whole thing, a nightmarish hallucination brought on by lack of sleep. But when I turned to go, I felt something in my hand. It was the receiver from the rotary phone, its cord trailing into nothing, frayed at the edges as if it had been ripped from the wall. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at it, my hands trembling. I dropped it, watching as it clattered to the floor, the sound echoing through the empty hall. I didn't stay to explain what happened. I left the Porter Hotel that night, walked right out into the freezing air, and didn't look back. Mr. Keene tried calling me the next day, but I never picked up. A few days later, I passed by the hotel on my way into town, glancing up at the 7th floor. The curtains in room 717 were drawn, but for just a split second, I thought I saw her face staring down at me, grinning from behind the glass. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching, waiting for the next person who wouldn't be able to resist that open door. And every so often, when I pass by, I swear I still hear the faint ring of a rotary phone echoing from that empty, forgotten room. I moved into the apartment in late spring, hoping the change of scenery would do me good. It was a big old building with creaky floors and narrow hallways that always seemed a little dim. I loved it. There was something timeless about the place, like it had seen 100 stories play out in its rooms. I felt lucky to have found it. The first few days were quiet as I settled in. The building was only half occupied, so I rarely saw other tenants, except for an elderly woman on the first floor and a young couple I'd hear sometimes coming and going at odd hours. Other than that, it was just me and my cat, Misty, exploring our new home. It was about a week after I moved in that I first noticed the photo. I'd come back from a late shift at work, tired and ready to collapse, when I spotted something propped up against my door. It was a black and white photo, slightly faded, showing a hallway, a narrow one, almost exactly like the one outside my apartment. In the photo, the hallway was empty except for a door at the far end, just barely cracked open. I picked it up, feeling a slight prickle of unease. There was no note, no explanation. I glanced up and down the hallway, but it was empty, silent. My neighbors' doors were all closed. I shrugged it off, assuming someone had left it by mistake and tucked it into a drawer. The next day, there was another photo lying right outside my door. This one showed the same hallway, only this time, the door at the end was open wider, like someone had pushed it open just a little more. I picked it up, feeling a twinge of discomfort. It was probably a prank, I told myself, something a kid would think was funny. I looked around, half expecting to see someone watching, but the hallway was deserted, the only sound the hum of the old radiator. I threw the photo away and tried to ignore the strange feeling that had settled in the back of my mind. 2 days passed, and I found another one. This time, the photo showed the door at the end of the hall fully open, with just a hint of something, someone standing in the shadows beyond. The figure was barely visible, more of a shape than anything, but it was enough to make my heart skip. It was starting to feel personal, like whoever was leaving these photos knew exactly how to get under my skin. I took this one straight to the landlord's office. He was a grizzled man with a permanent scowl, more interested in keeping the heat running than dealing with tenant complaints. When I handed him the photo, he squinted at it, shrugged, and said, "Probably just some kid messing around. This place is full of weirdos." I pressed him, asking if there was any way to find out who was leaving them, but he just waved me off, muttering something about pranks and kids these days. Frustrated, I went back to my apartment, trying to shake the image of that open door from my mind. That night, Misty started acting strange. She'd always been a calm, easygoing cat, but suddenly, she became jumpy, staring at the front door, her tail fluffed up and twitching. She'd sit there for hours, staring like she was waiting for something, her eyes wide and unblinking. It was unnerving, but I told myself she was just adjusting to the new place. But then I started hearing noises. It was subtle at first, a faint creak in the hallway, a soft shuffling sound like someone moving outside my door. The kind of noises you could easily dismiss in an old building. But as the nights went on, the sounds grew louder, more deliberate. Sometimes, I'd hear a soft scratching at the door, followed by a faint knock, almost too soft to hear. One night, I worked up the nerve to look through the peephole. The hallway was dark, the single overhead light flickering. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow at the far end, just out of reach of the light, but when I blinked, it was gone. The next morning, I found another photo. This one was different. It showed the hallway, but from a different angle, like it had been taken from my door looking out. The door at the end was still open, and the figure in the shadows was closer now, just visible, with what looked like long hair hanging over its face. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. Whoever was doing this wasn't just leaving photos, they were inside the building, taking them from just outside my door. I went back to the landlord, demanding he take it seriously, but he just grumbled about ghost stories and told me to let him know if anything else happened. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound made me jump. Every creak felt like it was right outside my door. Misty was on high alert, pacing back and forth, her eyes darting to the door every few minutes. I lay in bed, straining to hear anything over the pounding of my heart. At around 3 a.m., I heard it. The faintest of knocks, slow and deliberate. 3 soft taps like someone testing the door. I froze, barely daring to breathe. The knocking came again, this time louder, more insistent. I crept out of bed, my heart in my throat, and moved slowly toward the door. I pressed my eye to the peephole, half expecting to see an empty hallway. But there was someone there. A figure stood just outside, hunched and still, their face obscured by long, tangled hair. I couldn't see their eyes, but I could feel their gaze, cold and unblinking, fixed on the peephole as if they knew I was watching. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. I called the police, my hands shaking as I tried to explain what was happening. They arrived 20 minutes later, but by then, the hallway was empty. They found nothing, no sign of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. The officers exchanged looks, one of them muttering something about overactive imaginations. They told me to call again if anything happened, and left. The next day, there was another photo. This one showed the inside of my apartment, taken from just inside the door. The angle was low, almost like it had been taken from the floor. My heart raced as I realized it was a shot of my living room, with Misty sitting on the carpet, staring straight at the camera. I couldn't breathe. Someone had been inside, while I was asleep, while Misty was here alone. I checked every lock, every window, but there was no sign of how they'd gotten in. I tried to reach the landlord again, but he wasn't answering his phone, and his office was locked. That night, I stayed up, every light on, clutching my phone, ready to call for help. Around 2 a.m., the knocking started again, louder this time, more insistent, as if someone was pounding on the door with their fists. Misty bolted under the couch, her fur standing on end, her eyes wide with terror. I forced myself to look through the peephole again, and my blood went cold. The figure was closer now, their face almost pressed against the peephole. I could see the outline of a hand, long fingers resting against the door, and a pair of dark, empty eyes staring right at me. I stumbled back, the air thick with panic, and the knocking stopped. There was a long silence, and then a faint scratching sound, like nails dragging down the wood. The next morning, I packed up and left, breaking my lease without a second thought. I didn't care about the deposit, didn't care about the landlord's complaints. I just needed to get out. A few weeks later, I got a call from the landlord. He sounded different, rattled. He told me he'd finally gone into the apartment to check things over and found a stack of photos left in the middle of the floor. They were all of the same hallway, the same open door at the end, but in each photo, the figure was closer, moving down the hall, frame by frame, inching closer to my door. The last photo was of the door itself, taken from just inches away, with a single word scratched into the wood. Stay. I hung up, changed my number, and tried to put it all behind me. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that faint tapping, soft and patient, as if it's waiting for me to open the door. I don't know how to start this. It's been almost a year since it happened, and I'm still trying to convince myself it wasn't real. But then, I'll catch something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow, a flicker, and I feel the fear crawling up my spine all over again. So here goes. Last October, I booked an Airbnb for a solo weekend away in the mountains. Work had been stressful, and I needed some quiet, some solitude. The cabin was perfect, rustic, tucked away in the woods, with a porch that looked out over a lake. It was exactly the kind of place where you could sit by the fire, read a book, and feel a million miles away from everything. I was excited. The host's directions were clear. Park by the old woodpile, take the path down the hill, and the cabin will be on your left. I got there just as the sun was setting, and the trees cast long, slanting shadows across the driveway. It felt eerie, but in a good way, like I was stepping into a different world. I parked, grabbed my bag, and started down the narrow path. When I found the cabin, it looked even better in person, small and charming, with little candles flickering in the windows. The air was crisp, the scent of pine and wood smoke filling the air. I let myself in, dropped my bag, and did a quick tour of the place. The first floor was just a cozy little living room with a fireplace, an old kitchen with a creaky wooden table, and a steep staircase leading up to the bedroom loft. But as I walked through the living room, I noticed something strange. On the wall, Above the fireplace was a framed photograph of an empty room. Not a painting, not a landscape. A room? It looked like it could have been a photo of the cabin itself. But the space in the photo was completely empty. Bare floors, bare walls, and a single window, casting light onto the floor. I figured it was just some kind of artsy decor choice, maybe a photo of the cabin before it had been furnished. I brushed it off and went about my night, making a quick dinner and settling down with my book. But after an hour or so, I felt restless. Something about the cabin was getting to me. I tried to ignore it, but I kept glancing up at that photograph, that stark, empty room that seemed almost too empty, like it was waiting for something to step into it. I finally went upstairs to bed around midnight, hoping a good night's sleep would put my mind at ease. The bedroom was simple, a small bed, a dresser, and a window overlooking the lake. I felt safe up there, wrapped in blankets with the sound of the wind rustling the trees outside. I fell asleep quickly. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up, heart pounding. The cabin was dead silent, too silent, like the air itself was holding its breath. And there, from downstairs, I heard a faint creak, like footsteps on old wood. My pulse spiked, and I lay there, listening, wondering if maybe it was just the house settling. But the sound came again, slow, deliberate, like someone was walking across the floor. Step by step, I sat up, holding my breath, every nerve in my body on edge. The footsteps moved across the living room, pausing directly below my bedroom. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, as if something was standing there, waiting. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen listening. Eventually, the footsteps faded, and the cabin went silent again. I barely slept after that. I kept telling myself it was just an old cabin making old cabin noises, but there was something wrong about it, something I couldn't shake. The next morning, I went downstairs and found everything exactly as I'd left it. The fire had died down to embers, and sunlight was spilling through the windows, casting warm light on the floors. But as I glanced up at the photo above the fireplace, I felt a jolt of shock. The photograph had changed. It was subtle, almost easy to miss, but I could swear that the shadows in the room were different. The light from the window now fell at a slightly different angle, stretching out longer across the floor. It made the room look colder, emptier, and there at the very edge of the frame was a faint, dark shape. It wasn't clear, just a blurry shadow, but it looked like the outline of a figure standing just out of view. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe a trick of the light or a flaw in the photo, but it didn't help. I could feel that same sense of unease crawling over me, that feeling that I wasn't alone. Determined to shake it off, I decided to go for a hike. I spent most of the day out in the woods, trying to convince myself that everything was normal. The fresh air helped, and by the time I got back to the cabin, I was feeling a little more like myself. I made dinner, poured a glass of wine, and tried to relax. But as the sun went down, that same creeping dread returned. I felt like I was being watched, like something was lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. Every time I glanced up at the photograph, that shadow seemed a little closer, a little more defined, like it was slowly inching its way into the room. I went to bed early, hoping that if I just ignored it, the feeling would go away. But around 3 a.m., I woke up again, heart racing, the same heavy silence filling the cabin. I lay there, straining to hear anything, and then from downstairs, I heard it again, the slow, deliberate footsteps moving through the living room. This time, they didn't stop. They came up the stairs, one step at a time, the old wood creaking under each slow, heavy footfall. I held my breath, gripping the blankets, listening as the footsteps stopped just outside my bedroom door. And then nothing. Silence. I lay there, paralyzed, waiting for the door to open, waiting to see something standing there in the dark. But the door never moved. After what felt like an eternity, I finally worked up the courage to reach over and turn on the bedside lamp. The room was empty, the door closed, and everything looked normal. But that sense of wrongness was stronger than ever. I barely slept the rest of the night. At dawn, I packed my things and headed downstairs, eager to get out of the cabin. But as I reached the living room, I couldn't help but glance up at the photograph one last time. My stomach dropped. The photo had changed again. The dark shape was now standing in the center of the room, fully visible, and I could see that it was a figure, tall, shadowy, with a face that was just a blur. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the room in the photo wasn't empty anymore. There was someone else in the frame. It was me. I don't know how, but there I was sitting on the floor in the photo, my face pale and my eyes wide with terror, looking up at the figure towering over me. I felt my blood run cold, and I stumbled backward, grabbing my bag and rushing out the door without looking back. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I told myself it was a trick, a prank, something I'd imagined. But that photo, that image of myself sitting there in the dark, looking up at whatever that thing was, I can't get it out of my head. I called the host later, just to see if they'd say anything about the photo, but they acted like they didn't know what I was talking about. I tried looking up the cabin, but the listing had been taken down, no trace of it anywhere. I even went back to the spot a few weeks later, but the cabin was gone like it had never existed. Sometimes late at night, I feel like I can still see that photograph in my mind, the way the shadows closed in, the way my own face looked so afraid. And every so often, I'll hear a faint creak in the darkness, like footsteps coming closer, one step at a time. I bought the house in a hurry, more out of necessity than choice. My lease was up, and the rent everywhere had climbed so high that owning, even an old, rundown place, was somehow cheaper. The seller was all too happy to make a deal, and I signed the paperwork without hesitation. It was just an old Victorian, faded and full of creaks and quirks, a little neglected but nothing I couldn't handle. The first few nights were quiet. I was still living out of boxes, trying to make the place feel like mine, when I began noticing odd things here and there. It started small, a draft in the hallway, even though I'd shut all the windows, or footsteps echoing down the hall when I knew I was alone. I told myself it was just the house settling. The place was old, after all. But on the third night, I found something that made me pause. I'd been unpacking in the kitchen when I opened a drawer, and there, nestled among the old cooking utensils, was a small, dusty book. It was a diary, worn and brittle with age. Curiosity got the better of me, and I sat down to read it, flipping carefully through the pages. Most of it was the ramblings of a woman named Margaret who had lived here decades ago. But one page caught my eye, standing out from the rest because of how deliberately it was written. If you find this, do not stay here past the 7th night. I laughed at first, thinking it was some kind of prank. Maybe the previous owners left it behind as a joke. But there was something chilling about those words. The handwriting was tight, almost frantic, as if the writer had been desperate to make her point. I brushed it off, telling myself it was probably just an old tale or superstition, and went to bed. But as the days passed, things grew stranger. Lights flickered randomly. I'd hear doors creaking open and shut on their own. And there was always that faint draft in the hallway, the one that sent shivers down my spine every time I walked past it. On the 5th night, I was in bed, trying to convince myself to sleep, when I heard something in the basement. It was a soft, steady tapping, barely noticeable, like fingers drumming on wood. I lay there, holding my breath, listening as the sound continued, each tap precise and deliberate. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, but there was something too rhythmic about it. I turned over, pulled the blankets tight, and somehow drifted off, only to wake up around 3 a.m., my heart pounding. When I went downstairs the next morning, I found something strange. A small, wooden box had appeared on the kitchen table. It was just sitting there, slightly open, with a single item inside, a small, tarnished key. I hadn't seen the box before, and I had no idea where the key might lead. But something about it felt wrong, like it had been left for me to find. I put it back in the drawer and tried to forget about it. That night, I locked every door, closed every window, and double-checked each one before going to bed. Just as I was drifting off, the tapping started again, this time louder, more insistent, coming from just beneath my floor. It was directly under my bed. My skin prickled, every nerve on edge as the tapping grew louder, closer, as though someone, or something, was making its way up through the floorboards. I lay frozen, counting each tap, waiting for it to stop. but it didn't. And then, suddenly, the sound stopped altogether, leaving a thick silence that felt even more suffocating. I stayed awake for hours, too terrified to move. When the sun finally rose, I forced myself to go back to the kitchen. And there, on the table, was the box again. This time, the key was missing. My blood ran cold, but I convinced myself that I'd just misplaced it, that I'd forgotten where I put it in my panic. The sixth night, I decided to sleep on the couch, hoping that being closer to the door would help me feel safer. But as soon as I closed my eyes, the tapping began again, now coming from all around me. It was in the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. It was faster, more desperate, like whatever was making the sound was trying to break through to reach me. I covered my ears, but the tapping grew louder, drilling into my mind. And just as I was about to scream, it stopped, leaving an unbearable silence. I barely slept that night. When I finally opened my eyes the next morning, I knew something was different. The house was too quiet, the air too thick. I felt like I was underwater, my senses dulled, my body weighed down by an unseen force. I stumbled through the house, checking each room, feeling like something was watching, waiting. That evening, as I was brushing my teeth, I looked up into the bathroom mirror and froze. In the reflection, there was a shadow standing behind me. Its face was just a blur. No features, no eyes, only a faint, dark outline that seemed to pulse with something malevolent. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The seventh night came. I knew I should leave, that I shouldn't have stayed, but something compelled me to stay, something that felt like curiosity or maybe fear. I sat in the living room, watching the clock, counting down the minutes to midnight, my heart pounding. And then, just as the clock struck 12, the house seemed to come alive. Every door, every window slammed shut, the walls shuddering as if something was pounding from within. The tapping was back, louder than ever, filling every inch of the house, faster and faster until it became a deafening roar. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air thickening with a smell of decay and rot. And then, just as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The silence was absolute, the kind of silence that seems to hum with tension. I sat there, too afraid to move, when I felt it, a cold hand, resting gently on my shoulder. I didn't turn around, didn't even breathe, frozen in place as the grip tightened, cold fingers pressing into my skin, their touch icy and dead. A voice whispered in my ear, soft and barely audible. I warned you not to stay. And then, the hand let go. The air cleared, the house fell silent once more. I ran, grabbing only my keys and the clothes on my back, leaving everything behind as I bolted out the door, never looking back. I didn't sleep for days. I found a cheap apartment across town and moved in, leaving the house and everything in it, abandoning it all as though it had never belonged to me. But some nights, when the city is quiet, I still hear it. That soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the walls, as though it's calling me back, waiting for the day I return. It was supposed to be a quiet night. I was house-sitting for my aunt, who lived in one of those grand, old Victorian homes on the edge of town. She was the type who loved history, antiques, and anything old and mysterious, so her house was filled with a mix of elegant and eerie artifacts. The house itself was gorgeous in the daytime, with big bay windows, high ceilings, and intricate woodwork. But at night, it had a different feel entirely. The creaks seemed louder, the shadows longer, and you couldn't shake the sense that someone might be watching from the darkened corners. My aunt had left a detailed list of things to keep an eye on, most of which I ignored until around 11 p.m., when I figured I should at least do a quick walkthrough of the place. Everything looked as it should. Doors locked, windows shut, lights off. But when I passed through the hallway that led to the study, I felt a sudden, intense chill, like I just stepped into a refrigerator. The house was old and drafty, but this was different, unnatural. I brushed it off, convinced myself it was just my imagination, and went back to the kitchen to make some tea. But that's when I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound like someone dragging their feet across the floor. I stopped, holding my breath, waiting. It came again, a little louder this time, coming from somewhere down the hall. My heart was pounding, but I told myself it was probably just the pipes settling or the house creaking. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I tiptoed back to the hallway and called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The sound stopped immediately, leaving only an eerie silence hanging in the air. For a long minute, I stood there, staring down the dimly lit corridor, half expecting something or someone to appear. But nothing happened. Feeling a little silly, I went back to the kitchen, but I left the hallway light on, just in case. I sat down with my tea, trying to ignore the prickling sensation at the back of my neck, when suddenly, the light in the hallway flickered, then went out. I nearly dropped my cup as the house fell into darkness. I checked my phone, it was still on, so the power hadn't gone out. Heart hammering, I grabbed a flashlight from a drawer and went to the breaker box in the basement, hoping it was just a tripped circuit. The basement was everything you'd expect from an old Victorian house, cold, damp, with thick cobwebs hanging in every corner. I fumbled with the breaker, flicking the switch a few times, but nothing happened. When I turned around, shining the flashlight to guide my way, I froze. There, at the bottom of the basement stairs, was a small, old-looking door I hadn't noticed before. It was partially hidden behind some shelves, barely large enough for a person to fit through. My aunt had never mentioned anything about a door down here, and judging by the amount of dust on the floor around it, it looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached the door, crouching down to examine it. There was a faint inscription scratched into the wood, faded and worn, barely visible in the dim light. I could only make out a few letters here and there, but the message was unmistakable: "Do not enter." I backed away, every nerve in my body screaming to go back upstairs. But just as I turned, I heard it again, that shuffling sound, louder this time, coming from behind the door. I stood there, paralyzed, as the sound grew closer, like something or someone was moving toward me from the other side. The door rattled, the doorknob shaking as if someone were trying to open it. In a panic, I turned off the flashlight, hoping that whoever or whatever was behind that door wouldn't notice me in the darkness. I held my breath, pressing myself against the wall, heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away. The doorknob stopped rattling, and for a moment, there was complete silence. And then I heard a voice, low, whispering just on the other side of the door. I couldn't make out the words, but there was something chillingly familiar about the tone. It was almost like my own voice, a faint, distorted echo of myself, repeating a single phrase over and over. I strained to hear, and my blood went cold when I finally understood the words. "Let me in." I ran up the stairs, stumbling in my haste, slamming the basement door shut behind me. I locked it, backing away slowly, my eyes glued to the doorknob, half expecting it to start turning. But everything was still. The house was deathly quiet, save for my own ragged breathing. I took a few shaky steps backward, unsure of what to do, when I felt something brush past me. I whipped around, shining the flashlight through the living room, but there was nothing there. Just an empty room, cold and silent. But I could feel it, an icy presence lingering in the air, watching me. The hairs on my arm stood on end, and I started backing toward the front door, my only thought now being to get out of that house, no matter what. Just as I reached for the doorknob, I heard the whisper again, coming from behind me, soft and insistent. "Let me in." I spun around, flashlight shaking in my hands, but there was nothing there. Just the empty, darkened hallway, stretching out like a tunnel, pulling me deeper into its shadows. Without another thought, I wrenched the front door open and ran outside, into the cool night air. I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of the property, my chest heaving, my mind racing with what I'd just experienced. I didn't go back inside that night. Instead, I waited in my car until dawn, watching the house as the first light of morning crept over the horizon. When my aunt returned, I told her about what happened, every chilling detail, but she just looked at me with a strange expression, half amused, half concerned. "That old house has its quirks," she said with a small smile. "Sometimes it just remembers things." I didn't ask what she meant, and I didn't stay to find out. To this day, I don't know what or who was behind that door. But every so often, I'll wake up in the middle of the night, in the safety of my own home, and I swear I can hear it. That soft, familiar whisper, coming from somewhere just out of sight. Let me in. When I rented the little cottage on Briar Lane, I thought I'd found a dream spot. It was cheap, tucked away at the edge of a quiet village, and full of charm. Creaky wood floors, ivy-covered walls, and a tiny garden out back. It was the kind of place I'd always wanted, a getaway to focus on my writing. The landlord was a strange, jittery man who barely looked at me during the walkthrough. Perfect place for a writer, he mumbled. Then he'd added, almost as an afterthought, just don't be looking in the windows too late at night. It's an old house, likes its privacy. He tried to laugh it off, but his eyes darted nervously to the cottage, as though he'd just let slip a secret. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just some local superstition, and happily moved in, feeling I'd escaped the noise of the city and all the anxieties that came with it. For the first couple of days, the cottage was everything I'd hoped it would be. The village was quaint, the nights were quiet, and I was finally making progress on my novel. But on the third night, something changed. It was around midnight, and I was writing by the light of my laptop when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned, glancing at the window, but there was nothing there. Just the reflection of the room and the dark garden beyond. I shook it off, blaming it on the usual tricks of light, and went back to my work. But not 10 minutes later, I saw it again, just a faint shift like a shadow moving across the window. This time, I got up and opened the window, peering into the garden, hoping to see a fox or maybe a stray cat. But the yard was still, every leaf motionless in the cold night air. I shut the window and locked it, feeling a slight chill, but more out of caution than fear. After all, it was an old house. Things creak, windows draft. I went back to my laptop and tried to focus. Around 2 a.m., as I was finishing up a chapter, I heard a faint tapping. It was soft at first, barely audible, but as I sat there, it grew louder, more insistent, coming from the direction of the window. I glanced over, expecting to see a branch knocking against the glass, but there was nothing. No trees near enough to reach it, no birds or animals around. I got up, telling myself it was just the wind, but when I approached the window, the tapping stopped. I stared at the glass, and for a moment, I thought I could see something, a faint smudge like a fingerprint pressed right against the center of the pane. I leaned closer, squinting to get a better look, but as I did, I felt a rush of cold air, though the window was firmly shut. I pulled back, a chill creeping up my spine. That night, I barely slept, jumping at every little sound, every creak and groan of the cottage settling. I told myself it was just nerves, that moving to a new place always came with a period of adjustment. But the tapping didn't stop. The next night, it started around midnight again, soft and rhythmic, as though someone was standing outside, just tapping, waiting. I tried to ignore it, even put on my headphones, but the sound crept through, growing louder until it seemed to fill the entire room. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside, determined to prove to myself that it was just my imagination. I swept the beam across the garden, peering into the shadows, but there was nothing there. Just the old stone walls, the ivy, the silent trees. I turned to go back inside, but just as I reached the door, I felt it, a presence, a cold, heavy feeling like I was being watched. I spun around, shining the flashlight across the yard, but still, there was nothing. No movement, no sound. Just an eerie stillness that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I went back inside, locking the door behind me, but as I turned to head upstairs, I caught a glimpse of something in the window, a face. It was there for only a split second, a faint reflection in the glass, but I saw it clearly. Pale, with wide, dark eyes staring right at me, expressionless and hollow. My heart pounded as I backed away, trying to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, a shadow, something explainable. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. There had been something there, watching me. The next day, I tried to find the landlord, hoping he could offer some reassurance, or maybe even an explanation. But when I knocked on his door, an old woman answered, looking at me with a mix of confusion and pity. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said, her voice trembling. He passed away last year, dear. The cancer took him. I froze. No, that can't be. He showed me the house just a week ago. She shook her head, her face pale. That's impossible. There's no one left to show the house. She paused, her eyes darting nervously to the window. You're not the first to ask, though. I left, feeling a growing unease, but determined to get to the bottom of it. That night, I sat by the window, waiting the flashlight by my side, hoping I could confront whatever was happening. Around midnight, the tapping started again, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. I forced myself to stay calm, breathing deeply, waiting for whatever it was to make itself known. And then, slowly it did. A shadow appeared in the garden, faint at first, then solidifying, taking form. It was a figure, tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes, its face obscured by shadow. It moved toward the window, slowly, deliberately, and as it drew closer, I felt that same cold presence, that same sense of being watched, only stronger this time, more intense. The figure reached the window, and I found myself frozen, unable to look away. It raised a hand, pressing it against the glass, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I thought I could see a face, my own, reflected back at me, but twisted, with eyes that were hollow and empty. I backed away, my heart racing, but as I did, the figure seemed to press harder against the glass, the reflection growing clearer, more defined, until it looked like a mirror image, staring back at me with an expression I'd never seen before, cold, angry, almost desperate. Then, without warning, the figure disappeared, vanishing into the darkness, leaving only the faint outline of a handprint on the glass. That was the last night I spent in the cottage. I left the next morning without looking back, leaving my things behind, not caring what happened to them. I moved to a new place, somewhere bright and modern, far from the quiet, ivy-covered charm of Briar Lane. I tried to forget about it, tried to convince myself it had all been some strange, sleep-deprived hallucination. But every now and then, late at night, I hear a faint tapping at the window. Soft, rhythmic, as though someone is standing just outside, waiting. And sometimes, when I catch a glimpse of my reflection in a dark window, I see something else there. A face that looks like mine, but isn't, staring back with hollow eyes, as though it's still waiting for me to come home. It was the last week of September, and I remember that specifically because the leaves outside our window were starting to turn, and Lydia had put out all her fall decorations, lighting her favorite pumpkin spice candles in every corner of our apartment. There was this cozy warmth to it all that felt so much like home. We'd been together for 6 years by then, our lives intertwined with routines and inside jokes, all the small, ordinary things that make a relationship feel unbreakable. But lately something had been off. At first, it was subtle. She'd seemed distant, her smile just a bit too quick to fade, her laugh not quite reaching her eyes. I told myself it was work stress. She'd been putting in a lot of late nights, handling new projects, and sometimes she'd come home looking completely worn out. I'd wait up for her, reheating whatever dinner I'd made, and doing my best to be supportive. I'd even packed little notes in her lunch bag, silly reminders of how much I loved her, hoping it might brighten her day. She'd text a quick thanks in response, but that was it. It wasn't like her, but I brushed it off. Then one night, I was lying in bed waiting for her to get home when I heard her phone buzz on the dresser. It wasn't the usual soft buzz of a notification, but one of those persistent ringtones. And when I glanced over, I saw a name pop up that I didn't recognize, Alex. I thought about answering it, but something held me back, that instinctive feeling you get when you know there's a truth you're not ready to face. The call went to voicemail, and I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to my own heartbeat pound in my ears. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling. I wanted to ask her about it, but every time I opened my mouth, I found myself stopping short. I didn't want to come across as paranoid or clingy. Besides, we'd never had trust issues before. But as the days passed, she grew even more distant. She'd start making excuses to go out alone, claiming she needed time to herself, which was something she'd never said before. And when I asked her who Alex was, she shrugged it off, saying he was just a guy from work, someone who joined her team recently. I should have left it alone, but I couldn't. I'd see her smile at her phone, or catch her slipping off into the other room to take a call. She'd spend hours working late or going out for drinks with coworkers. It didn't add up, and I couldn't ignore the gut-wrenching feeling that something was happening right under my nose. One Saturday night, she went out again, saying it was a work thing and that she'd be back late. I tried to keep myself busy, cooking dinner, watching a movie, but I couldn't shake the feeling gnawing at me. Finally, I did something I'd never done before. I checked her laptop. It felt wrong, but I needed to know. Her messages were still open, and as I scrolled through them, my worst fears were confirmed. She'd been meeting Alex, not just for drinks, but for weekend getaways, dinners, even late-night drives to talk. The texts were full of inside jokes, little references I didn't understand, and phrases that left no room for doubt. There was a whole world between them, one I hadn't even known existed. When she came home that night, I was still sitting there, her laptop open on the coffee table. She stopped in the doorway, her face paling when she saw me. I didn't have to say a word. She sat down across from me, her eyes on the floor, and started talking in this low, halting voice. She told me that she'd met Alex at a work event months ago, that he'd made her feel alive in ways she hadn't felt in a long time, that she didn't know how things had gone so wrong between us. She said she was sorry, that she hadn't meant for it to go this far. But every word felt empty, like she was reading from a script she'd practiced in her head 1,000 times. I tried to listen, to stay calm, but there was this anger bubbling up inside me, this betrayal that felt like acid in my chest. I'd loved her, supported her, done everything I thought was right. And yet here she was, telling me she'd found someone else, someone who'd filled a space I hadn't even known was empty. I asked her why she hadn't just talked to me, why she'd gone behind my back instead of telling me how she felt. She didn't have an answer, and that hurt more than anything else. The next day, she packed a bag and left, saying she needed time to figure things out. She didn't say if she'd come back, and I didn't ask. I just watched her walk out the door, feeling like the entire world had tilted off its axis. The silence in the apartment was deafening. Every room felt wrong, haunted by memories of us. Her laughter in the kitchen, the way we'd curl up on the couch with takeout on lazy nights, the smell of her shampoo lingering in the bathroom. I tried to keep going, to pick up the pieces of my life and make sense of what had happened. Friends and family reached out, offering sympathy and support, but none of it felt real. I spent nights staring at my phone, wondering if she'd text, if she'd say she wanted to come back, that she'd made a mistake. But days turned into weeks, and there was nothing. Just this heavy, aching silence. One night, I went through that old album again, the one I'd found the day it all started to fall apart. This time, the photos felt different. I could see the cracks, the places where maybe we'd started drifting apart without even realizing it. There were photos of her laughing, but I noticed how my arm around her looked tense, how her smile didn't quite reach her eyes in some of them. Maybe we'd both been pretending for a long time, clinging to the idea of what we used to be instead of facing the reality of what we'd become. Months passed, and slowly, painfully, I started to heal. I found new routines, things that were just mine, moments of peace that felt fragile but real. I started going for early morning runs, something I'd always talked about but never had the discipline for. I cooked meals for myself, learned new recipes, found joy in simple things. I even redecorated the apartment, painting over walls that had once felt like they belonged to both of us, making the space feel new, like it was just mine. Eventually, I heard that she and Alex had moved in together, that they were doing well. Strangely, it didn't hurt as much as I thought it would. She'd found her path, and maybe I'd found mine. I still have days where the memories creep in, where I wonder if things could have turned out differently, but those thoughts don't hold me captive anymore. Looking back, I see that sometimes people drift apart, not because of one big thing, but because of 1,000 small ones. We'd both let our relationship coast, thinking it was enough, thinking that love was something that could survive on its own without constant care. I'd lost her, but I'd also found something I hadn't known I needed myself. And now, as the leaves start turning again, I feel like I'm finally ready to let go, to make peace with the past, and move forward into whatever comes next. It was 3 a.m. when my phone buzzed with a new notification. I'd been lying in bed, half asleep, vaguely listening to the sound of rain tapping against my window. I reached over, expecting a spam email or some app reminding me to drink more water. But instead, there was a new message from a contact simply named unknown. You have 3 minutes. Do not look outside. I sat up, instantly alert. My apartment was silent, save for the rain outside, and I could feel my pulse quickening as I stared at the message. I've been getting weird spam texts lately, so I assumed it was another one, but there was something about the words that made my skin prickle. 3 minutes? I shook it off, my logic kicking in. Someone was probably just trying to scare me. But as I put my phone down, the rain outside suddenly stopped, like someone had flicked a switch. The silence was deafening. I didn't realize how used to the sound of the rain I'd been until it was gone. Now everything was too still, too quiet, and I felt an overwhelming urge to, look outside. But something in me hesitated. Instead, I grabbed my phone again, staring at the message, feeling a strange tension build in my chest. Then, another message. Do not look outside. You have 2 minutes. My heart pounded as I glanced toward the window. The blinds were down, but a faint light seeped in from the street lamp outside. I don't know why I was feeling so paranoid, but the urge to look out the window was growing. I shook it off, grabbing my phone again and typing out a quick response. Who is this? I hit send, waiting, my hands clammy. No response. I told myself it was nothing, just a prank, probably someone in the building messing around. But then, another message appeared on the screen. You have 1 minute. Whatever you do, do not look outside. A bead of sweat trickled down the back of my neck. I don't know why, but I believed the message. Every instinct screamed at me to obey, to keep my gaze fixed anywhere but the window. The silence outside was eerie. My apartment felt too still, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums. I wanted to believe this was a prank, some random weirdo on the other side of a screen laughing as they messed with me, but something deep inside told me that wasn't it. Another message came through. 30 seconds. I clenched my jaw, hands shaking as I resisted the overwhelming urge to look. It was like there was a presence in the room, leaning in closer with each second that ticked by. I could almost feel eyes on me, a prickling at the back of my neck that made every nerve scream. Then finally one last message. Do not look outside, no matter what you hear. At that moment, there was a knock on the window. My heart stopped. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The knock was soft, rhythmic, and somehow familiar, like the way a friend might tap if they were outside, waiting for you to open up. My body felt frozen, every instinct screaming at me to stay still, to follow the instructions in the messages. I squeezed my eyes shut, feeling a chill seep through me. The knocking came again, louder this time. 3 gentle taps, almost inviting, as if coaxing me to come closer. My hands balled into fists, and I held my breath, desperately willing myself not to move. But then I heard a voice. Hey, it's me. Let me in. My blood ran cold. The voice, it sounded exactly like mine. I felt lightheaded, like I was falling out of my own body. It was impossible. It had to be impossible, but the voice was unmistakably mine, right down to the slight rasp I got when I was nervous. Come on, the voice said, a strange, pleading tone lacing through it. It's cold out here. Let me in. My phone buzzed again, and I glanced down, my vision blurring from fear. Do not respond. Do not look. The knocking became more insistent, the voice more desperate. Please, it said, sounding choked. I'm right here. I know you can hear me. Just let me in. Please. Every muscle in my body screamed to run, but I was paralyzed, glued to my bed as the knocking grew louder, faster. The voice outside became frantic, desperate, shouting now in my exact tone, my exact cadence. Why won't you look at me? It demanded, its voice breaking. I'm you. I need you to let me in. I need you. Then the knocking stopped. Silence fell over the room again, so thick I could hardly breathe. I gripped the phone in my hand, waiting, counting the seconds as the stillness stretched on. Part of me wanted to believe it was over, that whatever this was had finally given up. Then came one last knock, soft, almost defeated, and that same voice, barely above a whisper. I'm waiting. And then, As suddenly as it had started, the presence was gone. The rain began to patter against the window again, and the world returned to normal. I sat there, still clutching my phone, heart hammering in my chest as I tried to process what had just happened. After a long while, I finally glanced at my phone again, checking for any more messages. The notification from unknown had disappeared. There was no trace of the conversation, no record of the messages, nothing. I didn't sleep that night, didn't dare close my eyes. I kept expecting to hear that knock again, that pleading voice calling my name, begging to be let in. But the silence held, stretching long into the morning. For the next few days, I avoided my apartment after dark, spending as much time as I could at work, in cafes, anywhere but home. But every night around 3 a.m., I get that same eerie feeling, that sense of someone somewhere waiting. It's been a week now, and I still can't bring myself to look outside at night. Sometimes, I'll hear faint taps on the glass, soft and patient, and a chill will wash over me. The urge to look, to see, is almost unbearable, gnawing at my mind, a compulsion I can barely fight. And sometimes, if I listen closely, I can still hear my own voice, whispering from just beyond the window. "I'm waiting for you. Don't you want to let me in?" It was around midnight on a Friday when my neighbor knocked on my door, clutching a bright orange and yellow yo-yo in her hand. We hadn't exchanged more than 2 words in the 6 months I'd been living in the building. So seeing her standing there in her pajamas with a toy from the 90s was jarring, to say the least. "Can I come in for a minute?" she asked, as if we were old friends and she was simply borrowing some sugar. Sure?" I stepped back, opening the door wide enough for her to slip inside. She moved like she'd been doing this all her life, barefoot on the cold tile, her yo-yo swinging casually at her side. I couldn't decide if she was crazy, brave, or both. "Thanks," she said, wandering into my kitchen without waiting for an invitation. She took a seat at my small kitchen table, spinning the yo-yo in her hand, her eyes on the ceiling as if it held the answers to some cosmic riddle. "Do you need something?" I asked, still hovering near the doorway, unsure whether to sit down or just watch her until she left. She looked up at me, tilting her head as if the question were ridiculous. "Not really. I just needed somewhere else to be for a bit. Hope that's okay." For some reason it was... I nodded, closing the door and moving to sit across from her. She was probably my age, maybe a year or 2 younger, with wild curls that looked like they'd never met a brush and an oversized hoodie that had seen better days. She had a strange sort of calm about her, like someone who'd just come back from a long walk in the rain and didn't mind being soaked to the bone. So I started searching for something to say. "Rough night," she shrugged, looking at the yo-yo, spinning it slowly in her hand. "Not really rough, just heavy. You ever feel like everything's just pressing down on you all at once, like gravity turned up the volume?" I blinked, caught off guard by her honesty. "Yeah, all the time." She nodded, as if she'd expected that. "Me too." She glanced around my apartment, her gaze falling on the sad little fern in the corner that I'd been trying and failing to keep alive. You know, ferns need indirect light. They're resilient, but they need a little gentleness, too. I stared at her, wondering if she'd somehow read my mind, or maybe just my face. "I'll keep that in mind." She smiled, a small, private thing, and let the yo-yo drop, sending it into a lazy arc that swung back and forth. I used to do this all the time as a kid. I thought I was going to be a professional yo-yo artist. They have competitions, you know. I laughed despite myself. "You're kidding." "Nope," she said, grinning. "I practiced for hours. Learned all the tricks. Walk the dog, rock the baby, the Eiffel Tower. I had it all down." She demonstrated a trick where the yo-yo spun in a perfect circle before bouncing back to her hand. But I quit after I got second place in a regional competition. Some kid named Ryan beat me with a trick called Around the World, which I could never pull off without hitting myself in the face. She chuckled at the memory, her fingers playing over the toy's string. The yo-yo whirred again as she sent it flying down, pulling it back up with a flick of her wrist. Funny how those things stick with you, right? You think you'll let them go, and yet, she shrugged, looking away, her expression turning thoughtful. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the strange quiet of the night settle around us. There was something peaceful about it, sharing this little space with a stranger who was telling me stories of yo-yo defeats and old dreams. I hadn't had company over in months, but with her here, it felt less lonely, like we were both a little bit lost and didn't mind sharing it. Do you ever feel like you're still trying to win some invisible competition? I asked, surprised by my own question. She looked up, her eyes sharp with recognition. All the time, except now it's not some kid named Ryan. It's, well, I don't even know what it is. But I feel like it's out there keeping score. We both laughed softly, as if that simple admission had cracked something open in both of us. She went back to the yo-yo, the familiar rhythm filling the silence, a quiet mechanical hum. For a while, that was enough. So what do you do? She asked, breaking the silence. Finance. At a company downtown. Mostly spreadsheets, numbers. Nothing as glamorous as competitive yo-yoing. She snorted. Trust me, it's not glamorous. But hey, if you're ever in the market for a career change. Yeah, I said, half joking. Maybe I'll pick up a yo-yo. She nodded approvingly, as if this was the most reasonable thing she'd ever heard. It helps, you know. Focusing on something small. It's like a reset button. When the world gets too big, I just focus on keeping the yo-yo spinning. It was an oddly profound thing to say, but somehow it fit her perfectly. She let the yo-yo drop one last time before catching it and tucking it into her pocket. Well, thanks for letting me crash for a bit, she said, standing up. I think I'm ready to go home now. I walked her to the door, not sure if I'd ever see her again, but strangely okay with that. She brought a sliver of calm into my apartment, a momentary pause from the weight of the everyday, and I felt grateful, even if I couldn't fully explain why. Hey, I called out just as she reached the hallway. What's your name? She turned, giving me that same small smile, like a secret she was about to share. Margot, she said, her voice warm and soft, the name lingering in the air long after she'd gone. The door clicked shut, and I was left alone in the silence of my apartment, a strange lightness settling in my chest. I glanced at the little fern in the corner, then back at the empty kitchen table, feeling the quiet in a way I hadn't before. For the first time in months, I felt lighter. Like maybe I could be resilient too. Like maybe I just needed a little gentleness. That night, I dreamed of yo-yos and city lights, and when I woke up, I was still smiling. I found myself at the store the next day, buying a yo-yo on a whim. It was bright red, gleaming and new, and I spent an entire Saturday afternoon learning to get it to spin without falling flat on my face. I practiced over and over, the simple rhythm grounding me, bringing me back to something small and real. And when I finally got it right, I felt the tiniest spark of pride. A few weeks later, I ran into Margot in the elevator, her bright eyes lighting up when she saw the yo-yo tucked in my pocket. She laughed, reaching over to inspect it, her fingers brushing mine, just for a second. See, she said, grinning. I told you it helps. Focus on the small things, and the big things get a little easier. She stepped out of the elevator, her laughter echoing down the hallway as I stood there, clutching the yo-yo, feeling like I'd just found something I didn't know I'd been looking for. And from that day on, whenever life felt too heavy, I'd pull out the yo-yo, spinning it back and forth, letting it carry the weight of everything I didn't need to hold on to. One small moment at a time. It started as a typical night. I was out for a late run, headphones in, trying to clear my mind after a long day. The air was crisp, and the streetlights cast a soft glow over the empty sidewalks. I liked running at night. It was peaceful, almost meditative. Just me, the steady rhythm of my breath, the quiet streets. But about halfway through my route, I noticed someone else jogging a little way behind me. I glanced back briefly, seeing nothing but a vague shape in a dark hoodie. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just another night owl like me, and continued on. But every time I turned a corner or crossed the street, I could still hear footsteps faintly echoing mine. They'd stop when I stopped to catch my breath and resume as soon as I started moving again. It was a small sound, almost lost beneath my music, but it was there unmistakably. Feeling uneasy, I slowed my pace, hoping they'd pass. Instead, the footsteps mirrored mine, slowing to match my every movement. I couldn't help it. I glanced back again, catching a clearer view. The figure was closer than before, face obscured by shadows, just a pair of white sneakers visible in the dark. My pulse quickened, and I turned back around, trying to shake off the panic that was starting to rise. I turned onto a busier street, hoping to lose him in the brighter lights and noise of passing cars. But he turned too, matching my pace perfectly, always just far enough behind to avoid being too obvious. I could feel my skin prickling as I picked up speed, my heartbeat pounding louder than my music. I didn't want to run home, didn't want him to see where I lived, so I doubled back, crossing the street and heading into a small alley that led toward a busy intersection, hoping he'd finally give up. But he didn't. I kept glancing over my shoulder, and each time, there he was, always the same distance behind me, keeping a careful, deliberate pace. The fear was so sharp it was almost painful, like a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I pulled out my headphones, trying to think, trying to stay calm. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe he was just going the same way. Or maybe he was following me. I kept running, my mind racing, my legs burning, taking every twist and turn I could think of, but no matter where I went, he was always there. His footsteps were like a dark shadow trailing behind me, relentless, unwavering. I passed an all-night diner and seriously thought about going in and waiting it out, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. I didn't want to believe that something like this was actually happening. After nearly an hour of darting through random streets, I lost him. Or at least I thought I did. I was standing on the corner of my street, hands on my knees, panting and trying to calm down, when I saw him again, standing half a block away, watching me. He didn't come any closer, didn't say a word. He just stood there, half hidden by the shadows, the faint light catching his sneakers, and something deep in me turned cold. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off him, and when I reached my door, I slipped inside, locking it behind me. I thought it was over after that. Days went by without seeing him. I convinced myself it was a one-time thing, a random encounter, maybe even a weird misunderstanding. But a few nights later, I was on my way home from the grocery store, juggling a couple of bags, when I noticed someone standing on the opposite side of the street. Just a figure in the distance had pulled up, still watching. It was him. I could feel it, and every muscle in my body tensed as I tried to act casual, walking faster without making it too obvious. He followed me all the way to my building, maintaining his distance, staying just out of reach. I darted up the steps and through the door without looking back, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I told myself it was just a bad coincidence, that maybe he just happened to live nearby, and I'd bumped into him by chance. But the feeling of his eyes on me, that silent, steady stare, it stayed with me, filling me with a restless, gnawing dread. Then one night I got a package at my door. It didn't have a label or a return address, just my name, written in neat block letters. I hesitated, feeling a chill creep over me, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside, there was a single item, a tiny keychain-sized flashlight. It seemed innocent enough, but something about it felt wrong. It was like a strange, silent message, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I stared at it. The next night, I found another package. This time, it was a small notebook with blank pages, along with a single note that read, "Keep track." My hands were shaking as I set it down, trying to make sense of it. Was he trying to communicate with me? And if so, why this strange, cryptic approach? I wanted to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't happening, but I couldn't shake the feeling that these little gifts were some kind of twisted game. The days passed, and each night, there was something new at my door. A whistle, a bottle of water, a map of the city with certain routes highlighted. It was all so ordinary, and yet, taken together, it was horrifying. It felt like he was building some kind of connection, like each item was a part of some invisible plan that only he understood. I stopped leaving my apartment at night, started keeping the lights off, curtains closed, trying to create a wall between us. But every time I heard footsteps in the hallway, my heart would race, my mind filling with images of him, waiting just outside, watching. Then one night, I found a message scrawled on the sidewalk just outside my building. It was written in chalk, simple and almost childlike, but the words were chilling. "Running won't save you." I stood there, staring at the message, my breath coming in shallow, shaky bursts. The street was quiet, but I could feel him somewhere nearby, lurking just out of sight. waiting for me to react. I hurried back inside, locking the door, my mind spinning. I tried calling the police, but what could I even tell them? That someone left harmless things at my door? That someone I couldn't even describe had been following me? They listened, asked a few polite questions, but I could hear the doubt in their voices. Without evidence, without a face, without proof, it was just another anonymous complaint. I started keeping the flashlight and notebook with me whenever I left the house, half out of fear, half out of some strange need to play along, to pretend I had some semblance of control. It was almost as if he'd anticipated this, knew I'd cling to these objects as a way to feel prepared. And I hated it. I hated that he'd somehow crawled inside my mind, bending my actions to his will. Last night, I was on my way back from a friend's place when my phone buzzed with a notification. It was a picture, a blurry shot of me from behind, taken somewhere on my street. I stopped in my tracks, dread washing over me as I looked around, the shadows pressing in closer. Then I heard it, a single, loud whistle, echoing down the street. I turned, but no one was there, just the empty sidewalk stretching into darkness. When I got home, I found a final message waiting for me. This time, it was carved into the wooden frame of my door, scratched in rough, uneven lines. We're just getting started. I don't know who he is or what he wants. I don't know how he's managed to slip past every lock, every precaution, every attempt to hide. But I do know this. He's out there, somewhere, watching, waiting. And he's made it clear that no matter what I do, no matter how far I run, he'll always be there, one step ahead, controlling the game. About a year ago, I accepted a temporary night shift position as a security guard at a nearly abandoned hospital that was in the process of being shut down. It was one of those old, Gothic-style hospitals, built decades ago, complete with narrow hallways, flickering fluorescent lights, and wings that hadn't been used in years. I was supposed to keep an eye on the equipment that was left behind and make sure no one was sneaking in. The building had been mostly cleared out, except for a few storage rooms and the old psych ward in the East Wing, which had only recently been shut down and still had most of its equipment. The place was unsettlingly quiet. My supervisor warned me that it could get creepy, especially around the old wards, and told me I'd probably hear a few strange noises here and there. Place creaks a lot, he said, trying to play it off. Probably rats, too. Or maybe ghosts if you're superstitious, he added with a laugh. I laughed along, but as I started my first night shift, I quickly realized he wasn't entirely joking. My rounds took me through several floors of empty rooms, dimly lit halls, and a few dark stairwells that made me feel like I was descending into a horror movie. The air was heavy, thick with that stale, metallic scent of a place that hadn't seen daylight or fresh air in ages. Every creak, every rustle echoed, and even though I told myself it was just the building settling, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. On the third night, I was doing my usual rounds when I noticed something strange. A wheelchair parked perfectly in the middle of the hallway outside one of the patient rooms in the old psych ward. I distinctly remembered it being against the wall on my last round. I chalked it up to me just not paying attention and pushed it back, but as I turned to walk away, I swear I heard it creak. I whipped around, but it was still. After a moment, I laughed nervously, telling myself I was just jumpy. The night wore on, but around 3 a.m., I started hearing strange sounds. They were faint at first, soft whispers, almost like a distant conversation. I thought it might be the wind or old vents making weird noises. But as I made my way back through the psych ward, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't words I could make out, just hushed voices, overlapping and filling the empty space. I stood in the hall, straining to listen, but the second I tried to move toward the sound, it stopped. Feeling thoroughly unnerved, I decided to check the East Wing security monitors to see if any of the cameras had picked anything up. I sat in the dark, squinting at the grainy feeds, watching static and shadows flicker across the screen. For a few minutes, nothing happened, and I almost felt relieved until something moved on the monitor. In the grainy black and white feed from the psych ward, I saw a figure, half hidden in shadow, standing at the end of the hall. It was tall, too tall, and completely motionless. At first, I thought it might be a trick of the light, but as I kept watching, The figure started moving, slowly, almost like it was swaying back and forth. My heart raced, and I felt frozen, watching the shadow as it drifted in and out of view. And then, suddenly, it turned, moving down the hall toward the room where I'd found the wheelchair. I blinked, trying to shake off the feeling that something was horribly wrong. But then, on another monitor, I saw movement, this time in one of the old exam rooms on the first floor. The figure was there, standing completely still, staring directly at the camera, as if it knew I was watching. I broke out in a cold sweat, unable to look away. Its face was shadowed, features barely visible, but it was watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I knew I should call someone, another guard, my supervisor, anyone, but I couldn't bring myself to look away from the monitor. I watched as the figure slowly raised its arm, reaching out toward the screen, and suddenly, the feed cut out. I was left staring at static, heart pounding, completely alone in that dark, silent room. Then I heard it, the soft hum of the old elevator. It hadn't worked properly in years, supposedly deactivated because it was so old and unreliable. But now, it was moving, the faint whir of machinery echoing down the empty halls. The elevator was coming up from the basement, floor by floor, a slow, methodical ascent. I left the security room, edging down the hall, my flashlight casting long, wavering shadows across the walls. As I reached the elevator, I heard a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from inside. My hand shook as I pressed the button, and the doors creaked open slowly, revealing nothing but an empty car. I took a shaky breath, trying to steady myself, and stepped closer, shining my flashlight inside. That's when I saw them. Handprints. Dozens of them, smeared across the back wall of the elevator, small and ghostly, like the imprints of thin, frail fingers. They weren't just old marks from years of use. They looked fresh, almost wet, though the air was dry and stale. The sight made my skin crawl, and I backed away, feeling like I was being watched again from somewhere in the shadows. I decided I'd had enough for one night. I walked back to the security room, but as I rounded the corner, I froze. The wheelchair I'd moved earlier was back, right in the middle of the hall, facing me. I could feel my pulse racing, every nerve in my body telling me to run, but I forced myself to walk past it, refusing to look directly at it. Back in the security room, I grabbed my things, ready to bolt for the exit. But just as I reached the door, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a figure on the monitor again, standing in the hallway right outside the security room. It was closer this time, its head tilted as if it were listening. And then, slowly, its mouth began to open. I could feel the weight of its stare, even through the screen, and I stumbled back, heart pounding, as the camera feed flickered and went to static. Without thinking, I turned and ran. I don't remember much of the next few minutes, only that I bolted down the stairs, refusing to look back, and didn't stop until I was outside in the cool night air. I could have sworn I heard footsteps following me, echoing off the walls, but when I looked over my shoulder, there was nothing there. The next day, I called my supervisor and quit. I didn't give him details. I just said I wasn't coming back. He sounded oddly unsurprised, just sighed and said, "It happens." He didn't ask any questions, and neither did I. A week later, I got an envelope in the mail. No return address. I opened it to find a single piece of paper, an old, faded memo from years ago. It was a staff notice from the hospital, dated back in the 60s, reminding employees to lock the doors to the psych ward at all times. There was a handwritten note scrawled at the bottom, in faded ink, "She still walks the halls. Don't let her in." That was months ago, and I haven't set foot near that hospital since. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the faint hum of an elevator and the soft tap-tap-tap of footsteps echoing through empty halls. And I can't shake the feeling that she's still looking for a way. It started with the calendar. I'd bought it on a whim. One of those oversized desk calendars with crisp white pages and thick black lines. I'd planned to be productive this year, to organize my life, so I'd hung it on the wall beside my desk, where I could see every week at a glance. One morning, while sipping my coffee, I noticed something strange. On Tuesday, in tiny, neat handwriting, were the words, "Run the water at 3:15. I stared at it, puzzled. I hadn't written that. I lived alone, No roommates, no nosy friends. I thought back to the day before. Had I absent-mindedly jotted it down? I didn't even remember picking up a pen. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to a weird lapse in memory. But the note stayed in the back of my mind all day. That night, just before bed, curiosity got the better of me. I went into the bathroom, glanced at the clock, 3:14 a.m., and leaned over to turn on the faucet. The water gushed out, clear and cold, splashing against the sink. Nothing happened. I waited a moment, feeling ridiculous, and was just about to turn it off when I heard it. A faint trickling sound, as if the water were echoing in a cavernous space far below me. I leaned in, listening closely, and then there it was, a faint voice, barely audible over the rush of water. It was speaking quickly, like a recording sped up, words tumbling over each other too fast to catch. My heart pounded. I turned off the water and backed away, convincing myself I'd imagined it. Maybe it was pipes, or the whir of the plumbing. Maybe I was just tired. But as I crawled back into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the voice had been trying to tell me something. The next morning, I found another note on the calendar. Don't leave the apartment on Wednesday. I stared at the words, feeling a chill settle over me. I didn't like the idea of some invisible hand leaving instructions in my own handwriting. I thought about taking down the calendar, throwing it out, but instead I just stood there fixated on the new message. When Wednesday came, I stayed inside. I didn't really believe in the warning, but I worked from home that day just in case. Around noon, I looked out the window, watching the empty street below. A little later, I saw a car run a red light, colliding with another. I couldn't shake the feeling that I might have been in the middle of that intersection if I'd gone out. The notes continued, appearing in that same tidy handwriting, small suggestions that grew stranger by the day. Check the hallway mirror at exactly 12:07. Put your keys in the freezer before bed. Don't answer the door on Friday. I followed them all, partly out of fear, partly out of a sense of awe. Each instruction led to something odd, like glimpses of a world just slightly out of sync with my own. When I checked the mirror on Tuesday, for instance, I didn't see my own reflection. I saw a dim hallway, one that didn't belong to me, lined with old portraits of people I didn't recognize. I blinked, and the image disappeared. I thought about talking to someone, but how do you explain that your own calendar is telling you what to do? Weeks passed, and the notes grew more frequent, more insistent. Look under your bed tonight. Leave a cup of tea in the corner of the living room. One night, there was a particularly cryptic message. Wait in the dark at 2:33 a.m. I'd stopped questioning them by then, so I set my alarm for 2:30 and waited in the living room with the lights off. I sat in the darkness, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional tick of the radiator, wondering what exactly I was waiting for. At exactly 2:33, I heard footsteps, soft, measured, coming down the hall outside my apartment. I held my breath as they grew louder, closer. They stopped directly outside my door. I heard a faint rustling, like someone fiddling with the doorknob, and then a faint knock, a slow, deliberate rap. I was frozen in place, every nerve on high alert. Then, from just outside my door, a voice whispered, "I know you're in there." I didn't move, barely dared to breathe. The voice continued, calm and familiar, but with a strange, dissonant echo. "I've been waiting a long time to see you. Don't make me wait any longer." The footsteps retreated, fading down the hall, and I sat there, paralyzed until dawn, when I finally dared to turn on the lights. I stayed up all day, and by nightfall, exhaustion crept in, but I couldn't sleep. The notes had gotten under my skin, the routine of their bizarre instructions digging into my life in a way I couldn't escape. Then one night, a note appeared that was different. In larger letters, taking up nearly half the square, it said, "Prepare for a visitor on Sunday." The week crawled by, each day filled with a sense of impending dread. By the time Sunday arrived, I was a nervous wreck, my mind racing with possibilities. What kind of visitor? Who? Or what was coming? And why was the calendar, this inanimate object, somehow aware of it? I tried to keep busy, avoiding the clock, but around 8 p.m., I heard footsteps outside my door. This time, they didn't stop. They grew louder, passing directly through the wall, right into my apartment. I turned, heart pounding, to see a figure standing in the living room. It was me. Or rather, it was someone who looked almost exactly like me, but off. She wore my clothes, had my posture, my expression. But her eyes were too wide, her smile a little too sharp, her skin a little too pale, as if she were a faded photograph of me. "Hello," she said, her voice soft and unsettlingly familiar. "You've done well." I stared, mouth dry, unable to speak. She took a step forward, studying me with a detached curiosity. "Thank you for following the instructions. You made it easy." "Easy for what?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. She smiled, a strange, hollow expression. "Easy for me to take over." She took another step, and the room shifted slightly, blurring at the edges. I felt a tug, as if the floor were tilting beneath me, pulling me toward her. I tried to back away, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. What are you?" I gasped, reaching out to grab the edge of the desk for support. She tilted her head, that eerie smile never faltering. "I'm the one you left behind. The one who waited in the shadows. You followed the notes so well, brought yourself right here." My vision swam, the edges of the room stretching, warping, until it felt like I was looking at my life through a pane of frosted glass. She took another step forward, and I could feel myself fading, slipping further away with each breath. "Thank you for your place," she whispered, her voice echoing in my mind, filling every corner of my thoughts. The last thing I saw was her face, her eyes glinting with a triumphant satisfaction, as if she'd waited a lifetime for this moment. Now, I'm on the other side. I don't know how long I've been here. Days, weeks, maybe longer. I can still see her going about my life, wearing my face, smiling at my friends. Sometimes, she looks at the calendar, a small smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. She started leaving notes again, little reminders scattered around my old life. And every now and then, she leaves one just for me, a tiny scrawl I can see from this side, pressed up against the glass of reality. The latest note reads, "Don't forget, it's almost your turn." It was supposed to be a simple job. All I had to do was house sit for a week. My friend Mark had to leave town on business, and he offered to pay me to look after his place, feed his fish, water his plants. Easy money, right? The first few days were uneventful. Mark's apartment was nice, if a little outdated, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the city that glowed at night. He'd left detailed instructions, even drawn a little map for me. Fish foods under the sink. Don't forget to run the fan when you cook, and whatever you do, don't go into the guest room after dark. The last bit caught my attention. It was scrawled hastily in the corner of the note, almost like an afterthought. I laughed when I read it, thinking it was some kind of joke or attempt to mess with me. But Mark's sense of humor was never really that kind of weird, so I brushed it off as him being quirky. On the fourth night, I finally remembered to check out the guest room. Up until then, I hadn't had a reason to go inside. It was a small room, sparse, with just a bed, a dresser, and a painting above the bed. But that night, after dinner, curiosity got the best of me. I pushed open the door, half expecting something creepy to jump out. But the room was as boring as I remembered, except for the painting. It was strange. The painting was of a man in a dark suit, standing in front of a dense forest, his face obscured by shadows. There was something almost too detailed about him, like he'd been added to the scene by someone with an eerie sense of realism. His eyes, which were mostly shadowed, seemed to follow you wherever you stood in the room. It gave me chills, but I figured it was just a trick of the light. Then I noticed something else. The man was standing with his back toward the edge of the woods, but there was a faint smudge near his shoulder, almost like a hand was reaching out toward him from the shadows. I leaned closer, squinting, trying to make it out, and felt an unsettling prickle run down my spine. That's when I heard it, a soft tapping sound coming from somewhere behind me. I whipped around, heart racing, but there was no one there. The room was empty, the door ajar just as I'd left it. I took a shaky breath, laughing it off. Just my mind playing tricks on me, I told myself. But I was suddenly very aware of how quiet the apartment had become, how the hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the clock seemed muffled, distant. I closed the guest room door, deciding I'd had enough exploring for the night. Mark's after dark rule started to seem a lot less funny. The next morning, I found something new. On the floor outside the guest room door was a small, worn object, a button, black and shiny, with a thread still attached. I frowned, trying to remember if it had been there before, but I was certain it hadn't. It was strange, though. I didn't remember seeing any clothing in the guest room, and Mark didn't have a suit with buttons like that. A shiver ran through me. The button looked old, antique almost, like something you'd find on a vintage coat. I left it there, backing away as I tried to shake the weird feeling that was settling in. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the tapping again. This time, it was more deliberate, louder, as if someone were tapping on the window down the hall. I got up, tiptoeing toward the sound, my pulse thudding. When I reached the hallway, I realized the tapping was coming from the guest room. Heart pounding, I crept closer, reaching for the door handle with a hand that was embarrassingly shaky. I opened the door slowly, inch by inch, until I could just make out the painting. The man in the painting was different. His head had turned slightly, his shadowed eyes staring out directly at the door. He looked closer, somehow his feet positioned at the very edge of the canvas, as if he were leaning toward the front of the frame. I stumbled back, slamming the door shut. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but Mark's warning kept echoing in my mind. Don't go into the guest room after dark. I waited in the living room, every light on, trying to calm down, telling myself it was just an overactive imagination. I didn't go near the guest room for the rest of the night. The next day, I found another object on the floor outside the guest room. A small, crumpled piece of paper. It looked ancient, yellowed, and fragile. I picked it up, unfolding it carefully, only to find it blank. The paper smelled faintly of earth, or maybe something older, something that made the hair on my arms stand up. By now, I was desperate to talk to Mark. I called him 3 times, but he didn't answer. I left a voicemail saying something vague about strange things happening, hoping he'd get back to me. That night, the tapping started again. This time, I refused to check it. I stayed in the living room, trying to ignore the sound, but it was relentless. And then it stopped. For a moment, the silence was almost worse. But as I strained to listen, I realized I could hear breathing, soft and shallow, like someone standing just outside the living room door. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The breathing stopped. The air grew thick, heavy, as I crept toward the hallway. The light was dim, casting strange shadows across the walls, and the guest room door was slightly ajar. My heart thundered as I stepped forward, feeling like I was crossing some invisible line. I pushed the door open, my hand trembling, and froze. The man in the painting was gone. The canvas was blank, just a forest shrouded in fog, empty and still. I stared, my mind racing, unable to process what I was seeing. Then, from the shadows at the edge of the frame, something moved. A hand reached out, pale and slender, pressing against the inside of the canvas, as if it were a pane of glass. And then I heard the breathing again, right behind me. I whipped around, but the hallway was empty. The silence was so complete, I could hear my own ragged breaths, the pounding of my pulse. I backed out of the room, slamming the door shut and locking it, my hands slick with sweat. I didn't sleep that night. The tapping continued, louder and more insistent, as if someone were pounding on the walls from the inside, trapped and desperate to get out. By dawn, I made up my mind. I was leaving. I grabbed my things, hurriedly texting Mark that I couldn't stay any longer, that something was wrong with his guest room. But just as I was about to walk out the door, I heard a soft creak behind me. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. There, lying on the floor, was the old black button, and beside it, a single piece of paper with one line scrawled in faint, looping letters. Let him out. I didn't need to be told twice. I slammed the door behind me, leaving the apartment and whatever was in that guest room far behind. I haven't heard from Mark since. I've tried calling, but the number is disconnected. His apartment is up for rent again, and I wonder if I'll ever see him, if he's still around somewhere, or if he's somewhere else. And sometimes, late at night, I hear tapping at my window, faint and steady, like something trying to find its way back. This is going to sound insane, but I've started finding these messages from myself. It all started a month ago. I work late nights as a security guard at a tech office downtown. It's a quiet job, and most nights, I'm alone in a big, empty building, doing little more than wandering the hallways and scrolling on my phone. The office is modern and cold, with walls of glass and steel that turn into mirrors once it's dark outside. But that night, as I made my way to the break room around 2 a.m., something felt wrong. It was subtle, a weird tension in the air like the hum of electricity. I brushed it off as paranoia. Working alone at night can mess with your head. When I got to the break room, I found a note on the table. It was a piece of paper torn from one of the company's memo pads, covered in a rush scrawl. The handwriting was sloppy, but familiar. It was mine. The note simply said, "Don't go to the 4th floor." I laughed at first. I thought maybe someone had left it there to mess with me, but I was alone in the building. I hadn't seen anyone all night, and I would have known if someone had come in. Still, it felt like some kind of prank. But as I looked at the note, my chest tightened with a strange unease. Why would someone write that? Why would I write that? Curiosity got the better of me, and I grabbed my flashlight, heading straight for the 4th floor. The 4th floor was mostly conference rooms and a few empty offices. It was dead quiet, just rows of darkened rooms with wide glass walls. But as soon as I stepped out of the stairwell, I felt it. The temperature had dropped. The air felt heavy, dense, as if I'd walked into a vacuum. I turned on my flashlight and scanned the hall. Everything looked normal, just dark and lifeless. I was about to turn around when I heard a faint tapping noise from the end of the hall. It was rhythmic, soft, almost like someone knocking lightly on glass. My heart started pounding, but I forced myself to follow the sound, telling myself it was probably just the wind against the windows or some leftover vibration from the AC. I reached the last conference room, and that's when I saw it. Inside the room, written backwards on the glass in large, smudged letters, were 3 words: "Leave now. Please." I couldn't breathe. I knew, somehow, that I had written it. I could see the faint smears from where a hand had rubbed against the glass. My hand, writing backward, so that the message would be readable from the hallway. I turned and walked out of there as quickly as I could, my skin prickling, heart racing. I spent the rest of my shift in the break room, lights on, trying to ignore the unease gnawing at me. I told myself it was some kind of elaborate prank, or maybe I was just exhausted and losing it. But deep down, I knew neither of those explanations made sense. Over the next week, the messages kept appearing, each one written in my handwriting, each one stranger and more desperate than the last. I'd find notes saying things like, "Don't open the elevator," or "Stay away from the windows." Once, I came back from making rounds to find a note on my desk saying, "Check the cameras now." I practically sprinted to the security room, where the monitors showed only the empty, silent hallways. But when I rewound the footage, I saw myself on the 4th floor, staring at the glass wall, standing completely still for almost 10 minutes, even though I had no memory of being there. The worst part was the cameras never showed me leaving that room. Then, 2 weeks ago, I found the first video. I was making my usual rounds, checking doors and turning off any lights left on, when I noticed my phone was missing. I always kept it on me, so I assumed I'd left it in the break room. When I went back to look, I found it on the table, screen up, with a video queued up on the lock screen. It was a recording about 15 seconds long, taken in the 4th floor hallway. I could see myself in the video, standing just out of reach of the camera's frame, half shrouded in shadow. In the video, I looked wrong. My face was slightly blurred, like an out-of-focus photo, and my expression was blank, my eyes fixed straight ahead, staring at nothing. But then, without warning, I looked directly at the camera, directly at myself, and smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It was too wide, too forced, like I was trying to imitate the expression rather than feeling it. The video ended with me reaching for the camera, my hand stretching out just as my real hand shot out to lock the screen in terror. I put my phone down, heart racing, and stared at the blank screen, trying to make sense of it. That was not a video I'd ever taken, and it wasn't a place I'd ever stood in. Yet, it was my face. It was me. After that, the building felt different, like it was somehow alive. The walls seemed to close in on me when I walked through the halls. The windows seemed to darken even with the city lights outside. And then, just last night, I found a note that changed everything. It was written on the back of a company memo, the handwriting as familiar as ever. But this time, there was no instruction, no warning. Just 3 words, I am you. I couldn't breathe as I read it, the words looping in my mind like a broken record. I had been so sure that these messages were warnings, some version of myself trying to help me, guide me, but now it felt different. It felt like whatever was leaving the notes wasn't me, or at least wasn't only me. This morning I decided to do something drastic. I called in sick, telling my supervisor I had an emergency, and then drove out to a cheap motel on the edge of town. I spent the day trying to convince myself that I was just exhausted, maybe hallucinating, but even away from that building, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt thick, like the walls themselves were watching me. When I tried to go to sleep tonight, I found another note on my motel room table, in that same familiar handwriting. I nearly screamed. It read, "It doesn't matter where you go." Then, as I was sitting there trying to steady my breathing, my phone buzzed. It was a video notification from my own number. Hands shaking, I opened it. The video started in the 4th floor hallway of my office, the camera shaking slightly, moving toward the elevator. I could hear footsteps, my footsteps, echoing down the empty corridor. But there was no one in the frame, just the endless stretch of darkened office hallways. Then, after what felt like a lifetime, I saw something in the reflection of one of the glass walls. A shadow, shifting, growing clearer. It was me, or at least something that looked like me, staring back from the other side of the glass with that same twisted smile. The reflection slowly raised a hand, pressing it against the glass, as if reaching through it. I watched, paralyzed, as my hand in the video did the same, until our palms met in perfect alignment. And then, I watched as the reflection in the glass smiled wider, its mouth stretching impossibly far, eyes black and empty, and whispered, "I've found you." The video ended abruptly, leaving me staring at my own reflection in the black screen, horrified. I'm sitting in the motel bathroom now, the door locked, lights off, phone recording in my trembling hand. I keep hearing footsteps outside, but every time I check, the hallway is empty. I can feel it though. It's close, and I don't know how to escape. But here's the strangest part. There's something within me, some small, inexplicable part of me, that wants to open the door, that wants to let it. The first time I noticed it, I was checking my own reflection in the office bathroom. My face looked pale, and I was trying to rub the shadows out from under my eyes. Then I heard something, a small, almost imperceptible voice, a murmur like someone whispering too low for me to catch. I glanced around, but the bathroom was empty, stalls open, dead quiet. I shook it off as nerves and went back to my desk. Over the next few days, that feeling of being watched crept closer. I'd hear the same faint voice coming from empty rooms, from dark corners of my apartment. And every time I looked around, nothing would be there. When I was alone, I felt my skin prickle with the sensation of eyes boring into me. I began noticing small things out of place, too. A drawer left open when I knew I'd closed it, or lights left on when I came back home. My keys and wallet moved, as if someone had picked them up and then hastily put them back. It wasn't until later that things started to get personal. The notes began appearing about 2 weeks in, just little slips of paper tucked into places I'd find by accident. The first one was in my coat pocket. I'd been looking for my bus pass and pulled out a scrap of paper instead. Stop fighting it. I stared at it, confused, certain I'd never written it. But it was in my handwriting. I shoved it back in my pocket, thinking it was some kind of prank, maybe a message I'd scrawled for myself and forgotten. The next note showed up on my bathroom mirror, stuck there with a bit of toothpaste, so faint I almost didn't notice it. We're almost ready. Almost ready for what? The words unsettled me, but there was no one to ask. From then on, things spiraled fast. People started treating me differently, people I'd known for years. My friend Alana called me one night, saying she didn't appreciate me changing plans at the last minute, accusing me of telling her I couldn't make it to her party because I had better things to do. I hadn't even heard of this party, let alone declined an invite, but she wouldn't listen. Other friends started acting distant, and when I asked what was wrong, They'd just mutter that I knew what I'd done. I felt reality slipping. Every day, I'd find new notes in strange places. Under my pillow, inside my shoes, or taped to my car's rearview mirror. They all had the same cryptic messages. Trust the process. You're not alone. I'll make it easy. My handwriting, every time, it looked identical to mine, the letters shaped just like I'd written them. But I never remembered writing a single one. One night, I tried setting up my phone to record myself as I slept. I wanted to see if I was the one writing these notes, maybe during some sort of sleepwalking episode. I hit record, propped it on my nightstand, and lay down, staring up into the dark, trying to keep my eyes open. But at some point, exhaustion overtook me. When I woke up, the phone was on the other side of the room. The recording was still running, the battery nearly dead. I picked it up and rewound, watching myself fall asleep, tossing and turning until around 2 a.m., when the footage showed something that made my blood go cold. I saw myself sit up, wide-eyed, staring straight into the camera, my face blank and empty like a doll's. I reached for something on the nightstand, a pen I'd left there, and started scrawling on a piece of paper. I could barely make out the words in the dim light, but it looked like my own writing, the same slanted letters, writing something I couldn't read. Then I dropped the pen, looked directly into the camera, and smiled, a small, unsettling smile that felt like it didn't belong to me. After watching that, I couldn't go back to sleep. I lay awake, feeling my heart hammer against my ribs, convinced that any minute I'd feel that sensation of slipping away, of losing control to whoever had taken up residence inside me. That morning, I found a new note in my pocket. This time it was different. The letters were sharp, almost angry, but still in my handwriting. Are you ready? The question sat heavy on me all day. I went to work in a fog, barely hearing the words of my co-workers, but I could feel them watching me. I started noticing it more now, the sidelong glances, the way people seemed to be tiptoeing around me. I was catching snippets of conversations that stopped the moment I entered a room. There was a charged silence, as if everyone was in on something that I wasn't. That night, as I was washing up in the bathroom, I felt it again, that presence, like someone standing too close, crowding my space. I looked in the mirror, and for the first time, I saw it. Something watching me, something moving behind my eyes. I leaned closer, my reflection doing the same, and for a moment I saw myself, but not quite me. The figure in the mirror was standing a little too stiffly, its smile stretching too wide, its gaze colder than I'd ever seen my own. It tilted its head, studying me, and then, almost too faint to notice, it mouthed something. I could barely make it out, but the words seemed clear enough. We're ready. I stumbled back, knocking over a bottle of soap, heart pounding. The figure in the mirror was gone, replaced by my regular reflection, just me, wide-eyed and pale. But the memory of that smile, that cold, almost mechanical stare, stayed with me. The next day, people around me started acting like I'd missed something important. My boss greeted me with a strange, too friendly smile, asking if I'd made any progress. Progress on what? He didn't say. My friend Alana, who'd barely spoken to me for weeks, suddenly acted like nothing was wrong, like we'd never fought. She looked at me expectantly, waiting for me to say something, as if we'd already discussed it. Are you ready? She asked, smiling with that same strange, vacant expression. The words hit me like a physical blow. I tried to brush it off, but all day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd slipped into some parallel reality where everyone knew something I didn't. Every stranger's gaze felt heavy, like they were assessing me, like they were waiting. That night, I found the last note. It was lying on my pillow when I got home, a single sheet of paper with one sentence scrawled in my handwriting. You'll thank us for this. I stood there in my bedroom, staring at the note, fear clawing its way up my throat. Something was happening to me, something far beyond my control, and the worst part was I couldn't remember enough to know why. I could feel the edges of something vast and dark, like a memory slipping out of reach. I wanted to run, but somehow I knew it wouldn't matter. Wherever I went, this thing would follow. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, feeling the weight of that message, feeling my mind slip further and further from me. I felt that presence again, closer than ever, right behind me, right under my skin, whispering words I couldn't quite understand. It was as if something was waking up inside me, something that had been there all along. And then, in a flash of clarity, I knew. I remembered. I had asked for this. Some desperate part of me had wanted this, had called it whatever it was to take over, to push me aside. And as I stared at my reflection one last time, I felt that presence take hold completely. My face shifted, my expression hollowing out, and I realized that I'd been replaced. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was my own reflection, smiling back, eyes glinting with a strange, satisfied light, my own voice whispering back to me as I faded away. "We're finally home,"